Nothing We Named Aloud. By Void and Velvet. Chapter 1, 6 Languages and a Single Cot. The safe house smelled of old paper and turpentine, which Émile had come to associate with the particular quality of safety that was not quite safety but would have to do. He moved through the room above the bookshop the way he moved through every room he had occupied in the last 2 years, taking stock without appearing to, checking the window latch, noting the angle of the street lamp through the glass, the gap between the curtain and the sill. The habits were so old they did not feel like habits anymore. They felt like the way a room was supposed to be entered. The Germans changed the patrol schedule again, Margit said from the doorway. She was holding a lamp in one hand and an opinion about the Germans in every line of her face, though she rarely expressed it aloud. After 30 years of the bookshop and 2 of the safe house, she had developed a comprehensive economy with language. When? Tuesday. 11 becomes 9. 9 becomes 7. He'll come at dusk. We'll have an hour before the early patrol. Émile folded the edge of the map along the creased line and slid it under the loose board beneath the cot. He knows the approach. Margit set the lamp on the table and regarded the room with the expression of someone who has already catalogued its deficiencies and made peace with them. The second bedroom was indeed a storage room. He had said this in his message, briefly, without apology, because apology invited questions about alternatives, and there were none. The cot along the north wall had a blanket and a pillow. The table had a lamp and a candle stub. The shelf above the wash basin had a copy of Gide's journals that no one was going to read and a bar of soap that was nearly done. He's been in transit for 3 weeks, Margit said. He'll want a bath before he wants anything else. I'll heat water. I already heated water. She picked up the lamp again. Émile. He looked up. Try not to manage him to death. She went downstairs. He listened to her footsteps on the stairs and thought, I do not manage people. Then he thought, that is exactly what someone who manages people would think. Then he stopped thinking about it and went to check the window again. The second shelf of the bookcase along the east wall held the books he had accumulated in 2 years of using this room as a staging point between movements, a Proust he had read in sections during 3 separate stays, a battered Flaubert, a Camus he kept meaning to reread and kept putting off. L'étranger. He touched the spine once, absently, the way you touch something familiar when you are thinking about something else, and then went to the window. The street below was ordinary in the specific way that occupied streets had learned to be ordinary. 2 women with shopping. A man on a bicycle. A German officer standing outside the tobacco shop on the corner with the bored authority of someone who has been given a post he considers beneath him. Émile watched the officer for a moment, catalogued his posture, his sightlines, and looked away. At dusk, there was a knock at the bookshop door, 2 and then 1, the pattern they'd agreed, and Émile heard Margit's footsteps and then voices, low and brief, and then the footsteps on the stairs. The man who appeared in the doorway was taller than the operational profile had suggested. Not dramatically, perhaps an inch or 2, the kind of discrepancy that happened when someone filled out a description at a border crossing under duress. Blonde, going unkempt, the regulation hair length that had been allowed to grow past what regulation would have allowed. Pale, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone built larger than their life had recently permitted. Gray eyes that moved through the room, exits, sight lines, weight-bearing walls, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that it wasn't a decision anymore. He carried almost nothing. A bag that weighed, by the look of it, perhaps 5 kilograms. A coat that had been good quality once. He held his hat in his left hand. He looked at the room, looked at the cot, looked at Émile. Émile said, in French, you made good time. The man said, in French that was excellent and slightly textbook, the French of someone who had learned it from books before they learned it from people. The second checkpoint had a new man. He was slower. Did he flag you? No. He was slow because he was being careful about a woman in front of me. I waited. Émile processed this, found it satisfactory, and extended his hand. Émile. I know. A pause. Aleksander. He took the hand, brief and firm, and let it go. There was a quality to his stillness that Émile noticed immediately and then spent the next 10 minutes trying not to think about. Not the performed stillness of someone suppressing a reaction, the genuine article, the stillness of a man who had been so long in the habit of not drawing attention that he had stopped drawing it even from himself. He stood in the center of the room without filling it, without avoiding it, without any of the 100 small signals of discomfort or relief or performed ease that Émile had learned to read in everyone who came through safe house doors. He just stood there, looking at the room, as though he had been told it would be adequate and found the report accurate. "The cot," Émile said, and then stopped, because he had prepared the sentence. "The situation is practical, we have a blanket each, the shelf is yours," and found it unnecessary. The man had already looked at the cot. He was not performing discomfort about it. Alexander looked at the cot. Looked at Émile. Said, "All right." Émile found this, without being able to explain why, slightly destabilizing. He recovered. He was good at recovering. He showed Alexander the window latch and the loose board and the arrangement with the lamp, 2 knocks if Margit needed them to be quiet, 3 if they needed to move. He explained the patrol schedule. He showed him the map of the relevant streets. Alexander looked at the map with a focused, even attention, not nodding along but genuinely reading it, and once, only once, pointed to a street near the Saône and said, "This bridge. Is it still open at night?" "Until 10. "Good." He filed this and said nothing else. Margit came up with a bowl of something that was mostly potato and a piece of bread, set it on the table, and said to Alexander, "Bath is downstairs when you want it. The water is warm for another hour." Alexander said, "Thank you." The way he said it was not performative. It was the way you said thank you to something you had actually needed. Margit looked at Émile with the expression of someone who had decided to reserve judgment and had not quite managed it. Then she went back downstairs. They ate. The operation had given Émile very good habits around silence in shared spaces, comfortable enough not to fill it compulsively, careful enough not to let it become something that required interpretation. This silence, he noticed, required no effort at all to maintain. Alexander ate without haste and without comment and occasionally looked out the window with the disinterested attention of a man checking the weather rather than the street, though Émile understood he was checking the street. After, Alexander went downstairs for the bath. Émile spread the map again and made notes in the margin in a hand too small to read at distance, the route for the first dead drop, the timing, the contingency. He heard water below. He heard nothing else. When Alexander came back upstairs, his hair was damp and his coat was folded over his arm and he looked, Émile thought, approximately like a person. The running had not left him. But there was something that had loosened very slightly, like a knot given a millimeter of slack. He said, "The maps are operational as of when?" 3 days ago. "The checkpoint information is current as of yesterday." Alexander nodded. He sat on the cot, on the side nearest the wall, and looked at the map Émile had left on the table, though he didn't touch it. "How long do you think we have before the papers are ready?" 4 to 6 weeks. Parent cell is processing from the Swiss side. The route requires specific timing. Another nod. He said nothing more. After a moment he lay back on the cot, still dressed, and put his arm over his eyes. Émile blew out the lamp on the table and took the candle to the washbasin. He cleaned up in the dark, or nearly, enough candle to navigate, not enough to be visible from the street. Behind him, the sounds of Alexander's breathing slowed and steadied and became the deep even rhythm of someone who had learned to sleep anywhere, under any conditions, and was doing so now with a thoroughness that suggested he had not slept well in some time and was not going to waste the opportunity. Émile lay down on the cot beside him, on the side nearest the room. The cot was adequate. This was an accurate description. They were not touching, but the space between them was the space between two people who are sharing one cot and have both decided to be reasonable about it, which is not very much space. He stared at the ceiling. He was not, in the usual way of things, someone who lay awake. He was practiced at a kind of deliberate rest, lying still, breathing slowly, letting the operational inventory run its quiet course and settle. He was good at it. He had developed it over the course of 2 years, in which the alternative was to lie awake cataloging what he had declined to feel about the things he had seen. He lay still and breathed slowly and constructed sentences in French, which was too familiar to be interesting, and then in German, which he used operationally and found himself avoiding now for reasons he didn't examine, and then in English, and then in Arabic, which his mother had taught him in pieces, the way you teach a child something you are afraid they won't need long enough to use. He went through 6 languages and found all of them insufficient. In none of them could he account for why he had found the man's stillness destabilizing. In none of them could he account for the quality of the silence in the room, which was not an absence of sound so much as a presence of something that had come in with Alexander and sat down without asking and showed no signs of leaving. He turned this over. Set it aside. Turned it over again. Beside him, Alexander slept with the ease of someone who had solved the problem of where he was by simply ceasing to be a person who needed the problem solved. Émile looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he looked at the shelf along the east wall, though it was too dark to see the books, and thought about the orange spine of the Camus he'd touched on his way to the window. He thought, it is the first night. This is the particular strangeness of the first night in any shared space. It will be ordinary by morning. He thought this carefully and at length and almost believed it. Outside, the streets of Lyon were quiet in the way they had learned to be quiet since 1940, not peaceful, but practiced. The patrol went past at 11 o'clock, the footsteps regular and uninterested. The lamp in the street made a pale square on the ceiling that moved as the clouds moved and then was still. Émile was still awake when the square faded. He was still constructing sentences. He did not, in any of his 6 languages, find the word for the specific quality of Aleksander Voss's stillness, or why it had sat down in the room without asking and shown no signs of leaving. He would not find it for another 3 weeks. He would write it down before he found it, which is the way these things sometimes go. Chapter 2, The Cartography of Caution. The first thing Alexander did in any new space was find all the ways out of it. This was not paranoia. Paranoia was a failure of system, an emotion that had outrun its evidence. What Alexander practiced was something more like accounting, a careful inventory of contingency, conducted once and filed, so that the body knew what to do before the mind had finished deciding. He had been doing it for 3 years. He did it now. The room above the bookshop had 2 exits, the door to the stairs, and the window. The window opened to a ledge above the shop entrance, from which a man of average agility could drop to the street, 6 feet, perhaps 8, survivable without injury if you landed correctly. The door locked from the inside. The stairs had a landing that turned twice before reaching the bookshop floor, which would give a person descending a sight line disadvantage relative to a person ascending. These were the facts of the room. He put them away and stopped thinking about them. The second thing he did was take stock of Émile Renard. This was also not a romantic impulse. This was also accounting. You learned the person you were housed with the same way you learned the room, exits, vulnerabilities, the specific texture of their silences, because the person you were housed with was the variable you controlled least and the one most likely to cause a problem if you miscalculated. The problem with accounting for Émile Renard was that Émile Renard was himself very good at being accounted for. He was performing, and performing well, the warm professional competence, the fluent explanations, the economy of movement through a space he knew. Alexander had seen this performance in a dozen safe house contacts. It was the performance of someone who understood that the person they were sheltering needed to feel safe, and who had calibrated every element of themselves to produce that feeling. It was, Alexander thought, an act of genuine generosity, which made it no less a performance. What interested him, in the way that he allowed himself to be interested in things, was what he could see underneath it. Alexander spent the first 2 days watching Émile the way he watched all spaces, not staring, not cataloging with visible attention, but absorbing through the accumulation of small peripheral data. The way Émile's hands went very still when he was thinking, not fidgeting, but a studied stillness that was slightly too deliberate to be natural. The way he touched the spines of books on the shelf when he moved past them, not taking them down, just touching, as though checking they were still there. The way he asked questions, easy ones, well-timed, the kind that opened conversation, and then, when the conversation opened, revealed nothing about himself in return. You came away feeling known and realized only later that you had been the one doing the knowing. The pause was the most interesting thing. Alexander had a tell, he knew about it, had been trying to eliminate it for 3 years, and had not entirely succeeded. A fraction of a second before he answered anything he didn't want to answer, there was a pause. Very small. Not a hesitation exactly. More like the moment before a door opens, when the mechanism has engaged but the swing hasn't started. Émile noticed it the first time it happened, on the first morning. Alexander had said something brief about the Swiss papers and Émile had asked, in the same easy tone he used for operational questions, where he had come from before Lyon. The pause happened. Émile saw it. Alexander could tell from the way Émile's attention sharpened, by approximately nothing, by the kind of shift that a person without his particular education would not have noticed at all, and then Émile looked back at the map and did not pursue it. The fact that he had noticed was interesting. The fact that he had not pursued it was something else. He thought about Sophie, briefly and not by choice. The memory arrived the way it always did, her voice first, that particular flat precision, the way she finished sentences before they ended. They had worked together for 8 months, which was longer than Alexander had worked with anyone since the defection, and he had allowed himself, gradually and without meaning to think of her as someone who would be there tomorrow. He had carried her coffee once, before a crossing, because she was tired and he was not, and it seemed like a small thing. He remembered the specific expression on her face when he handed it to her. He did not know, now, if she was alive. He had not known for 9 months. He put the memory away. This was a skill he had developed in the same period and the same way as the room accounting. You could not stop the memories from arriving. You could put them away when they did. Margit Cours was the easier variable to catalogue, and he was glad of it. She ran the bookshop and the safe house with the same economy, declarative sentences, minimal waste, an absolute absence of the small performances people usually employed to put strangers at ease. On his first morning, she had come upstairs with coffee and a piece of bread and set them on the table and said, "There is a list in the kitchen of what you should not take from the cellar without asking." Then she had gone back downstairs. On the second day, she found him in the stairway and said, "I need boxes moved from the cellar to the back room. The ones marked in blue." He moved the boxes without comment. They were heavy. He found the back room and stacked them as she directed. She supervised by standing in the doorway and making a small sound of assent or revision, and when the task was complete she looked at the result for a moment and then at him, and something settled in her face. A decision finalized. She said, "Dinner is at 7 if you want it," and went back to the shop. He had not been given the criteria for the test and had passed it anyway. He found this, in a low-key way, satisfying. By the second evening, he had the shape of the household. Émile was careful and precise and had made the performance of ease so fluent that the performance had become a kind of ease, which was either impressive or concerning depending on what you thought ease was for. Margit was practical in the manner of someone who had watched France be complicated for 6 decades and intended to keep watching it. The bookshop below existed as its own small world, with its own specific gravity, the smell of old paper, the sound of Margit with customers in the afternoon, the quality of silence when it closed. The cot along the north wall was adequate. He had been in safe houses that were worse in every particular. He had not been in one that felt like this. The feeling was imprecise, which was unusual for him. He was, on most subjects, precise. But the feeling was something like the specific weight of an occupied room, not crowded, not heavy, just inhabited. The room above the bookshop was inhabited in a way that rooms became inhabited over time, when people had been living in them properly and not just using them. Émile had been here enough to have given the room that quality, and being in it was like being warm in a way that you noticed only once you had been cold for a long time. He noticed that he had noticed this and filed it under variables to monitor. On the third night, he read until past midnight, as he always did. Reading until the words stopped registering was the most reliable way he had found to make the machinery of his mind quiet enough to sleep. He was reading a history of the Languedoc that he'd found on the shelf, dry enough to be useful for the purpose, dry enough to be useful for nothing else. The lamp had been turned low 2 hours ago. He was reading by a light that was, strictly speaking, insufficient for reading. From the other side of the cot, Émile's side, near the room, while Aleksander occupied the side near the wall, came a voice. Not loud. Not awake loud, exactly, though it was deliberate enough that he could tell it was deliberate. There are candles in the kitchen drawer. Aleksander looked up. Émile had not opened his eyes. He looked at him for a moment. At the ceiling. Back at the page, which was now conclusively illegible. He thought about accepting the information as an operational note. He thought about saying something. He did neither. In the morning, the book was on the table and there were 2 candles beside it. He had not consciously decided to get them. He stood looking at the candles for a moment and thought, I should note that. He noted it. He put it in the category of variables to monitor. He put the category in the part of himself where he kept things he had decided not to examine. Then he lit a candle and made coffee, which was Margitte's coffee from her supply on the kitchen shelf, dark and slightly bitter, the way coffee was in this part of France. He made 2 cups because Émile would be awake in 20 minutes. He had been awake by 6 on each of the previous 2 mornings, and it required no additional resources to make 2 cups rather than 1. He thought, this is not particular attachment. This is efficiency. He thought, yes. He drank his coffee by the window and watched the street come alive in the particular gray of a Lyon December morning, and the candles were still on the table, and he did not put them back. Chapter 3, What the Maps Don't Say. Didi arrived at 9 in the morning on the 5th day with a newspaper under his arm and intelligence inside it. He was a man who had decided that confidence was its own protection, and who had the evidence to support this theory. He was slightly louder than the situation required in a way that managed, somehow, not to be dangerous, as though the city had agreed to accept him on his own terms, which it mostly had. He shook Émile's hand at the bookshop door and said, with the ease of someone who had been running operations since before he was ready to and had grown into them gradually, "You look tired." Émile said, "I look exactly the same as I always look." "That's what I said." Didi came inside, nodded to Margit with the familiarity of 2 years, and followed Émile upstairs. Aleksander was at the table with a map when they came in. He looked at Didi the way he looked at new people in rooms, with a brief, comprehensive attention that asked and answered the necessary questions before anything was said, and then returned to the map. Didi looked at Aleksander, looked at Émile, and had the grace not to make anything of it. "The drop schedule," he said, and gave Émile the newspaper. The intelligence was in the margins, 3 exchanges over the following week, each marked by a symbol that corresponded to a list Émile carried in his head rather than on his person. Place, time, contact. A change to the courier route that affected the 2nd drop but not the 3rd. A note about a checkpoint on the Rue Victor Hugo that had been reinforced since Tuesday. Émile read it once, memorized what was relevant, and handed it back. Didi burned it in the ashtray on the shelf. The 3 of them went over the drops. Aleksander asked 2 questions about the checkpoint reinforcement, specific, structural, and Didi answered them with the slight surprise of a man who was used to people accepting his briefings without interrogation and found the interrogation professionally satisfying. By the time they finished, the operational plan had changed in 2 small ways and improved in both. "Good," Didi said, and meant it. He looked at Aleksander with the frank assessment of someone who has decided to take the measure of a person and doesn't see the point in pretending otherwise. "They said you were competent." Aleksander said, "Who did?" "The network." A slight smile. It was a compliment. "I understood that." Didi laughed. He looked at Émile with the expression of a man who wanted to say something and had the sense not to. Then he went back downstairs and out the door and was, within 30 seconds, simply gone, absorbed back into the ordinary texture of the occupied city with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it a very long time. Émile looked at the map. He thought, the drop on the 9th. The Place Bellecour approach. He thought about the route and then thought about Aleksander knowing the route, and found that he had already, without making a decision about it, begun to assume Aleksander's presence in the operational planning in the way you assumed the presence of a competent collaborator, not consciously, not with fanfare, just as a fact of the situation. This was efficient. This was how it was supposed to work. He thought, yes. The café near the Place Bellecour was the kind of café that had been there since before the occupation and intended to be there after it, with the particular stubbornness of Lyon establishments that had survived previous difficulties and considered the current one another variation on the theme. It had a terrace that was too cold for outdoor seating in December, but the interior was warm and the windows were large enough to give a clear view of the square and the street that ran south from it. Émile arrived first. He ordered coffee, placed himself at the table nearest the window, and became the performance, a man reading a periodical with the moderate attention of someone who has no particular reason to be anywhere else. He was good at this. He had been good at it since before the war, when the skill was merely social, and better at it since, when it was survival. The German officer came in 15 minutes later, which was when Émile had expected him. Oberleutnant Weiss, young, fair, assigned to the administrative apparatus at the Hôtel de Ville, which put him near enough to useful information to make him worth managing and far enough from operational command to make the managing low risk. He had a habit of using the café on Wednesday mornings. He also had a habit, which he had not disclosed to his superiors, of visiting a certain apartment on the Rue de Brest on Tuesday evenings, which Émile had known about for 6 weeks and had not yet decided what to do with. He set the periodical down when Weiss approached his table, and performed the warm surprise of a man who has encountered an acquaintance at exactly the right moment. Oberleutnant. Please, sit. Weiss sat. He was pleasant company in the way of a man who was not unintelligent and had not yet been in the occupation long enough to understand what he was part of. He talked about Lyon, about the cold, about a concert he had attended at the opera and found surprisingly fine. Émile listened with the generous attention that was his most practiced performance, the one that made people feel singularly attended to, that made them feel their words were landing somewhere, being kept by someone who valued them. He asked questions. He said almost nothing about himself. He watched Weiss's face and extracted, from the texture of what Weiss said and did not say, a shape of the current administrative mood, tighter, since the North African landings. More anxious. Less certain of the conclusions it had been drawing. He filed this and said none of it aloud. At 3 tables distance, he was aware of Alexander without looking at him, aware of his stillness, his grey coat, the newspaper he was reading with the attentiveness of a man who had made himself unremarkable and succeeded. He looked at the newspaper with the particular kind of focus that meant he was looking at the room. Émile knew the difference because he did the same thing, with different objects, in different rooms. He wondered, briefly and without urgency, whether Alexander knew that he knew. When Weiss left, with handshakes and expressions of mutual regard that were entirely genuine on one side and precisely calibrated on the other, Émile sat for another 10 minutes with his cold coffee and let the performance settle back into whatever was underneath it. Alexander appeared beside him 2 minutes later, unhurried, as though he had simply decided to move tables and the timing was coincidental. He did not sit. He said, quietly, looking at the square, "Do you need anything from the baker's on the way back?" Which was the exit signal. Which meant there was nothing to follow up in the square, no tail, no irregularity in the foot traffic. Émile stood and left the appropriate coin on the table. They walked back through Lyon in the cold of the early afternoon, taking the longer route, the safe route, the one that moved through streets where the foot traffic gave them cover and the sight lines were clean. Alexander walked slightly behind and to the left, which put him in position to see anything Émile might miss in front. This was not discussed. This was simply where he was. They were on the Rue de la République when Alexander said, not as a criticism, not even with particular emphasis, just as a statement of observed fact, "You don't like him." Émile said nothing for a moment. The street was ordinary around them. A woman with a string bag. The smell of bread from somewhere. A bicyclist who navigated around them without slowing. He thought about saying, "Who?" He thought about saying, "Weiss is a useful operational contact." He thought about deflecting the question back. The habit was so old it moved before he decided. He said, "No." The word came out simply. It was the most direct thing he had said to Alexander in 5 days. He heard it in his own mouth and felt, faintly, the way you feel when you have put something down that you have been carrying for a long time and the absence of the weight is more noticeable than the weight was. Alexander nodded once, as though this were an acceptable answer, and said nothing more. They walked the rest of the way back in a silence that was not, Émile noticed, the silence of a thing undiscussed. It was the silence after a thing has been said, the particular quality of air in a room where a window has been opened, briefly, and then closed again, and the air inside is slightly different for it. He thought about this on the stairs. He thought about it again in the room, after Aleksander had taken off his coat and looked at the map and asked one question about the timing of the next drop. He gave the answer. They confirmed the schedule. The operational exchange was complete. He sat at the table after Aleksander had gone to wash up, and he thought about the word no, and how it had come out of him before he'd decided to let it, and what it was about this particular man, this deliberate, careful, quietly present man, that made things come out of him before he'd decided. He opened the Camus on the shelf. He looked at the first page. He put it back. He sat at the table. He took a sheet of paper from the drawer, operational paper, the cheap kind, the kind he used for notes. He held the pen. He wrote, "I have been trying to write this since the second week." And stopped. He looked at the sentence. He looked at it for a long time. He thought, since the second week means you have been thinking about this since the first, and you should decide whether you want to have that be something you put on paper. He folded the paper. He put it on the table. He looked at it. He took L'Étranger off the shelf, not to read, just to hold, the way you hold something familiar when the familiar is what you need, and opened it to the back. He stood there with both things, the book in one hand, the folded letter in the other. He looked at the empty back page. He put the letter inside the back cover. He told himself he would throw it away in the morning. This was not quite a lie and not quite the truth. He set the book back on the shelf, in its place between the Gide and the Flaubert, the orange spine facing out, and he went to make coffee, and he did not allow himself to think further about it that night. In the morning, he did not throw it away. Chapter 4, A Fluency He Didn't Study For. The walk back from the cafe had produced a feeling Aleksander did not immediately know what to do with. He processed it the way he processed most things that were not operational, at a remove, observationally, as though from a slight distance that would give it perspective. The feeling was warmth. Small, circumstantial, possibly not worth categorizing. The cause was a two-letter word said simply on a cold street by a man who did not say simple things. Aleksander thought, this is how it starts. He had thought this before, about Sophie, about others before her. About the specific quality of ease in certain people's company, the way some voices organize the air in a room differently from other voices, the way a person could move through shared space with an efficiency that was so attuned to yours that it stopped reading as separate movement and became something else. He knew how it started. He knew how it ended. He put the feeling away with the same motion he used for the Sophie memories, not suppressed, not denied, just filed in the category of things that were known and accounted for and required no further action. He thought, this is a controlled situation. 6 weeks, perhaps fewer. An operational partnership with a defined endpoint. He had managed these parameters before and would manage them again. He thought, yes. He thought about Lena for the rest of the afternoon, which was his tell, and which he did not recognize as his tell. Her most recent letter was the one he still carried, the last one before the silence. He knew it by heart. Had known it since the third reading, 8 months ago, and had read it again since then, the way you return to something not because you expect it to say something different but because you need to confirm it still says the same thing. Her handwriting was a specific thing, impatient, slanted forward, the handwriting of someone whose thoughts moved faster than her pen and had mostly given up trying to wait. She had written, among other things, between the usual news, the complaints about their aunt, the small precise observations about daily life that made her letters feel like spending an afternoon in her company. You always do this, Aleksander. You make yourself very useful and then you make yourself very gone. He had been trying to understand what she meant for 3 years. He had not, in 3 years, made significant progress. The week that contained the 3 drops was a good week, operationally. The first exchange went cleanly, a brief contact in a doorway near the Hotel Dieu, papers passed under the cover of a map consultation, the counterparty gone before the minute was up. The second was more complex, requiring Émile to perform a lengthy and apparently delightful conversation at a dinner party while Alexander moved the relevant material through a back channel they'd established with Didi, which required precise timing and a bicycle and a cold 40 minutes waiting in a doorway near the river, but which worked. The third was almost elegant, a bookshop transaction, which Margit facilitated without being told anything she hadn't asked to know, her ability to provide cover by simply being present in her own shop, a thing Alexander found himself appreciating with a specificity that was, he noted, beginning to acquire texture. He was noticing things with more texture than he was accustomed to noticing them. He noticed the particular way the bookshop smelled in the morning before it opened, paper and dust and the faint mineral cold of the Lyon winter coming through the door. He noticed the sound of Margit's footsteps on the stairs, which were different from Émile's in 3 specific ways that he had mapped without meaning to. He noticed that the lamp on the table made a particular shadow on the east wall at 6 in the evening in December, a shadow that moved when the street outside was busy and was still when it was not. He noticed, on the 8th day, that he had stopped checking the exits every time he entered the room. He noted that he had noticed this, and did not put it in the category of things requiring no further action. He put it in the category of things requiring monitoring. Then he did not monitor it very well. On the 9th day, they cooked dinner. It had not been planned. Margit had an engagement of her own, the vague kind she did not describe, which Alexander understood to mean it was none of his business, which he respected, and she had left things in the kitchen with the implication, communicated through spatial arrangement rather than instruction, that they were available. Émile looked at the things for a moment and then began to try to do something with them. Alexander watched this for approximately 4 minutes before the inefficiency became something he could no longer observe passively. The kitchen negotiation was wordless. Alexander took the pan. Émile moved to the table without being asked and set 2 plates and the salt. Alexander found onions and potatoes in the cellar, which Margit had apparently been keeping in reserve, and something cured in a cloth that turned out to be very good when sliced. He cooked without theater. This was simply what you did with onions and potatoes and a hot pan. It was not complicated. It was not a performance of competence. It was just dinner. Émile watched him from the table with the quiet attention he brought to most things. He had a piece of bread in his hand that he was not eating. "You cook," he said. "Yes." "I don't," Émile said, which was not quite accurate, but was accurate enough. He had been doing something earlier that could generously be called an attempt. He said it without embarrassment, simply as a statement of fact, which was how he said most true things. Alexander plated the food without comment. He put the better portion on Émile's plate, not conspicuously, just as a matter of proportion. He sat down across the table. They ate. Outside, Lyon was doing what it did in December evenings, the patrol, the distant sound of the city administering itself, the specific hush of a city that had learned to be quiet after dark and had the habit now even on nights when it was not necessary. Inside, the lamp was lit and the food was good and the bread was the bread Margit bought from the baker 2 streets over who had so far managed to keep his flour reasonable, and the wine, there was a bottle from the cellar, neither of them had suggested it, it had simply appeared on the table, was acceptable. This was not a remarkable dinner. It was a dinner in a safe house in a city under occupation, in winter, with food that was adequate, by lamplight, with a person he had known for 9 days. It was a temporary arrangement between 2 men in transit, one from the east and one from everywhere, who would be in different cities in 6 weeks and different countries after that. He knew all of this. The knowing was complete and detailed. He also knew, and this was the crack, the hairline fracture and the careful architecture, that for 20 minutes he had not thought about where the exits were. He had not thought about Sophie or about Lena or about the specific cold efficiency of the next operational step. He had thought about onions and potatoes and the quality of the cured meat and the way Émile's attention had a warmth to it that he did not perform, or if he did, performed so completely that the performance had become the thing. He had been warm, for 20 minutes. He thought, with great precision, sitting across the table from a man who was now eating the last of his bread, this is how it starts. He ate his dinner and said nothing and did not allow himself to linger on the warmth for longer than it took to name it. He put it in the monitoring category with the exits. After dinner, Émile washed the plates at the basin and Alexander dried them. This was not discussed either. It was simply what you did. When they finished, Émile put the plates on the shelf and looked at the kitchen with the expression of a man who has completed a task and is mildly surprised by the completion, and then he looked at Alexander. "Thank you," he said. The way he said it was the same way Alexander had heard him say it precisely once before, which was the way Alexander had thanked Margit for the bath on the first evening. Not performative. Actually meaning it for something actually needed. Alexander said, "It was practical." Émile said, "Yes," and looked at him for a moment with an expression Alexander could not quite read, which was unusual, because he was generally good at faces, and then went into the main room and picked up the gide from the shelf. Alexander sat on the cot. He thought about Lena. He thought about her handwriting. He thought about "You always do this," the impatience in it, the specific texture of the impatience, which was not anger but the particular frustration of someone who has watched a pattern repeat and cannot make it stop. He thought about what she had said after, the sentence he had read 100 times and still could not quite parse: "You make yourself very useful and then you make yourself very gone." He thought, "She is not wrong." He thought, "I am going to be gone in 5 weeks. That is the operational reality. Being here now is not being here. It is being in transit through here." He thought, "Yes." He thought, "In Hamburg, before the war, I had an apartment, and it was cold, and I slept in my coat in February." He thought, "This is not that." He lay back on the cot, on the side nearest the wall, which was his side. He realized, a side, and listened to Émile turn pages in the main room and outside the Lyon Street settle into their practice quiet, and the lamp on the table threw the shadow on the east wall, and the shadow was still. He was, without having decided to be, on the far side of the cot from the wall. He did not notice this immediately. When he noticed it, he noted it. He filed it in the monitoring category alongside the exits and the warmth and the 20 minutes without contingency planning. He did not move back. Across the room, after he had settled, he heard Émile set down the gide. He heard the small sound of a drawer opening and the scratch of a pen. He thought, "He is writing operational notes." He was almost certain this was what it was. He did not pursue the question further. He closed his eyes, and the lamp stayed lit for another hour, and the sound of the pen moving over paper was very quiet in the way that quiet things are sometimes louder than they intend to be. Chapter 5: The Man Who Asks the Wrong Questions. The dinner was at the home of Bertrand Favre, who was a bookseller in the sense that he owned a bookshop and sold books from it, but who was also, in the sense that mattered, a man who considered his house available for certain kinds of gathering that were not exactly the Resistance and not exactly not. He held these evenings periodically, 6 or 8 people, wine from the cellar, conversation that had learned to be careful without being paralyzed, and Émile attended because Favre trusted him and because these gatherings, while not operational, generated the kind of social intelligence that was occasionally useful and consistently worth maintaining. He had not planned to find Henri Lacoste there. He should have anticipated it. Henri attended everything that might be useful. Usefulness, for Henri, was not a principle but a practice. He had refined it to something close to an art, the art of being present in the right rooms before you knew which rooms would turn out to be the right ones. Émile had met him socially 3 times in the last year, had performed charm at him on each occasion, had come away knowing nothing about Henri he had not already known and feeling certain that Henri had come away knowing nothing about him. He believed this was accurate. He was, as far as he could tell, one of the few people in Henri's social landscape who generated no particularly useful information, and he considered this the most significant intelligence operation he had ever conducted. Henri was standing by the fireplace when Émile arrived, with a glass of wine and the warm, surface-friendly expression that was Henri's most dangerous instrument. He was not a man who looked dangerous. He was a man who looked like a good dinner companion, attentive, interested, the sort of person who remembered the names of your children. The danger was in the attention. Henri's interest was never without direction. Renard. The handshake was warm. "I didn't know you knew Favre. He carries a good selection of pre-war German philosophy," Émile said, which was true and meaningless. "You?" "Oh, we met at the Civic Committee. Tedious business, but one does what one can." Henry's voice had the slightly too warm quality of someone who has decided that warmth is good cover and has been using it for long enough that he no longer distinguishes between the warmth and the cover. Émile performed ease. It required, tonight, slightly more instrument than usual, which was a data point he acknowledged internally and filed. The dinner was 8 people, as expected. Favre's wife, who was kind and absent in the particular way of people who have made a decision about their involvement and are enforcing it consistently. A professor from the university who said very little and observed a great deal, which Émile noted. A couple whose names he didn't retain because they didn't require retaining. A woman, a physician, she said, when asked, who had the quality of a person who has had something happen to her recently and is managing it with great care. And Henri. The conversation moved through Lyon, through the winter, through the question of supply and the general difficulty of certain kinds of goods, through a concert someone had attended. Émile contributed where required, deflected where necessary, and watched Henri the way you watched a threat, not directly, not conspicuously, from an angle that gave him everything he needed. Henri began, over the second glass, on the subject of couriers. It was done well. Émile gave him that. He did not ask about specific couriers. He did not ask about names or routes or networks. He asked, in the interested, generalist tone of a man who finds all topics of equal intellectual fascination, about the mechanics of how people moved in and out of occupied France. About the underground infrastructure, how extensive did Émile think it was, really? He asked it the way you asked an academic question, the way you asked a man who read German philosophy his thoughts on the organization of resistance movements. Émile said, I wouldn't know. I suppose it's improvised, mostly. Things done under pressure tend to improvise themselves. He paused. Though I read that the Dutch have something rather systematic. Henri smiled at the Dutch, which was not where he had been going, and redirected. There was apparently a German, a defector, they said, who passed through Lyon recently. Perhaps 3-4 weeks ago. Interesting category, the defector. I've been thinking about it. What makes a man defect, do you think? Émile thought, you are very good at this and I have been doing this longer than you have. He said, conscience, perhaps. Or calculation. Probably both, in some proportion that varies by the individual. He let a beat pass. Or fear. I think fear drives more behavior than people are comfortable admitting. Said Henri, which was the sound of a man noting a non-answer without committing to having noticed it. He moved, smoothly, to another topic. Émile stayed for the appropriate time, said the appropriate things, performed his valedictions with warmth and a very good impression of a man with nothing on his mind but the cold walk home. He kissed Favre's wife on both cheeks. He told Henri it had been a pleasure. He walked out into the December night and down the street and around the corner before he allowed his hands to acknowledge that they were cold. They were very cold. He stood for a moment at the end of the street, cataloguing the specific situation. Henri was not looking for Alexander. He was looking for the category Alexander belonged to, the defector, the underground courier, the pattern of movement that might give him something useful to a particular kind of inquirer. He did not know Alexander existed. Maintaining this was possible. It required attention and a degree of luck and the specific kind of vigilance that was very tiring to sustain when you were also sustaining 6 other kinds. He started walking. He thought, as he had been trying not to think for the last 2 hours, Alexander will be awake when I get back. He would be awake because he did not sleep well before Émile returned on evenings when Émile was out, though he would not have said this and perhaps did not know that Émile had noticed it. The lamp would be low and he would have a book. He would look up when Émile came in and ask, with the precise economy of someone who has decided that the question is operational and has therefore permitted himself to ask it, any difficulties? And Émile would say, no. Minor intelligence. And they would both know he meant something more than that and neither of them would pursue it, and the not pursuing would be its own kind of conversation. He was almost at the bookshop stairs when he acknowledged the other thing, that the coldness in his hands was not only the December air and not only Henri. It was the feeling of having sat in a room with someone who was looking for the category Alexander belonged to and having had to perform warmth at that person for an hour and a half and having come home to the specific narrowness of the space between those two things. He stood outside the bookshop door. He thought, I am going to have to tell him. He went upstairs. The lamp was low. Alexander was at the table with a map, not the operational map, a different one, a pre-war French survey he had found somewhere, examining it with the even attention he brought to most things. He looked up when Émile came in. Any difficulties? Émile sat down in the other chair. He told him. Not everything, not the texture of Henry's warmth, not the way the question about defectors had landed. The shape of it, a contact with Gestapo adjacency, asking about underground couriers, asking about the category. Not specifically searching. Gathering. Alexander listened without reacting. His face did what it did when he was processing information, an evenness that was very slightly more even than usual, the operational stillness working. He asked 2 questions, whether Henri had been alone at the dinner, and whether Favre knew about the safe house. He knows there is a safe house. He doesn't know the address. Alexander nodded. What does Henri know about you? What he can observe in 4 social encounters. I give him very little. Good. A pause. He doesn't know what he's looking for yet. We have some time. He looked back at the map. Then, after a moment, you're cold. Émile looked at his hands. He had not, in giving the account, thought about his hands. Alexander stood without further comment and went into the kitchen. Émile heard the sound of the stove and then water and the particular small clink of the kettle being placed. He looked at the table. He looked at the pre-war survey Alexander had left open, the south of France, the coastal roads, the roads that led toward Spain and toward Switzerland and toward the various ways out of a country that had been closed. He thought about Henry's face and the warmth that was not warmth and the question about what makes a man defect. He thought about Alexander at a checkpoint 3 weeks ago, with papers that were not his name and a route memorized and a border crossing ahead of him, making the decision he had been making for 3 years, every day. He thought about conscience and calculation. Probably both, in some proportion that varies by the individual. Alexander came back with 2 cups of tea. He set one in front of Émile without asking if Émile wanted any. He sat back down across the table. Émile looked at the cup. It was hot enough to see the steam. He wrapped his hands around it. The warmth was, not dramatic. Not the warmth of a gesture made for performance. The warmth of a kettle boiled and a cup found and a decision made without deliberation to do a small thing that was needed. He said, "Thank you." He did not add anything. He drank the tea and Alexander looked at the map of the coastal roads and outside the streets were quiet and the lamp was low and neither of them spoke again for a long time, and the silence was the particular kind that had been accumulating for 13 days, small and specific and not yet named. Émile wrote the 3rd letter that night. He wrote it after Alexander was asleep, on the side of the cot away from the wall now, which Émile had noticed and decided not to examine, sitting at the table with the candle low and the pre-war survey still out and the tea-cup between them. He wrote both sides of the page and did not fold it until the light had gone cold. The handwriting was less precise near the bottom, which was how his handwriting went when he stopped performing and started meaning it. He put the letter with the first one, inside the back cover of L'Étranger, and went to bed. In the morning the book was on the shelf where it always was, the orange spine between the Gide and the Flaubert, and the letters were inside it, and the morning was ordinary, and he made coffee and did not think about it. He thought about Henri Lacoste, and the category, and the specific amount of time they had, and how to spend it wisely. He thought about that, very carefully, for a long time. Chapter 6, The Architecture of Surviving. Henri Lacoste was, operationally speaking, manageable. Alexander had worked this through by morning. The threat was real but not acute. Henri was gathering, not hunting. He had a category, not a name, not a face, not an address. The safe house remained clean. Favre knew it existed but not where, and Favre was not Henri, which mattered. The 3 drops had completed cleanly. The papers were in process. The departure window was 3 weeks away at the nearest, which was 3 weeks more than Henri needed to find anything that would cause a problem, provided Émile maintained his current contact discipline and Alexander continued to be a person who did not exist in Lyon's social landscape. This was all manageable. What Alexander could not manage, and had spent the morning not managing, was the image of Émile on the stairs. He had come upstairs before Émile the previous night. Émile was still outside, still on the walk back from Favre's, and he had heard the footsteps on the stairs and looked up, and there had been a moment, 3 seconds at most, before Émile had seen that Alexander was watching and rebuilt the expression into something even and professional and fine. 3 seconds in which the face had been unguarded. In which the performance had failed, completely, in the way that performances failed when a person had been sustaining them for 2 hours against something that required real effort, and the effort had run out on the last step. He had seen this before. In Sophie, the night before the crossing that took her. In others. He knew what it meant. He knew the particular quality of exhaustion in a face that had been held too long in the wrong shape. He knew it because he was familiar with the effort from the inside. He processed it as data. He filed it. He made the tea because the tea was needed and because it was a small concrete task, and he was good at small concrete tasks when the alternative was to sit with the data he had just filed and let it do what it was trying to do. He thought about Sophie instead. He had been doing this more than usual in the last 2 weeks, returning to Sophie when he felt himself moving in directions he had decided not to move, using her absence as a corrective. This was not cruelty. It was the application of evidence to a pattern he was trying to interrupt. Sophie had been specific to him. He had thought of her as irreplaceable in the operational sense, the way you thought of a very good partner, someone whose competence was so attuned to yours that losing her would require rebuilding from scratch. He had carried her coffee once. He had thought of her as someone who would be there tomorrow. She had been taken at a border crossing on a Tuesday morning, 9 months ago, and he had not heard from her since, and the network had no information, and he had learned, from this, the lesson he already knew but had allowed himself to forget, that specific attachment was a liability. That caring about someone particularly was not different, in practice, from putting a target on them. He knew this. He had the evidence. The evidence was called Sophie Brandt, and she was 32 years old, and he did not know if she was alive. He thought, "You are doing it again." He thought about Lena instead, which was the deeper corrective, the one that worked when Sophie stopped working. He thought about the last letter. He thought about "You always do this, Alexander." He thought about what this was. The problem, and he was aware, sitting at the table in the mid-morning with his second coffee and the operational map and the winter light coming through the gap in the curtain, that this was a problem, was that the corrective was not working as reliably as it had worked 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, thinking about Sophie had been sufficient to redirect him. Now he found himself thinking about Sophie and also thinking about Émile, and the two thoughts were not separating the way they should have been separating, which was a failure of system. He went over the operational picture again. He adjusted 2 contingency routes in his head. He considered the timing on the remaining drops. He thought about Père and Cell and the papers and the Swiss border and the life that was waiting on the other side of it, which was not very specific yet but which would become specific in time, a city, a room, a language he hadn't been using for survival, the long project of becoming a person with a future rather than a person with a series of presents. He thought about this carefully and with some detail, and it occupied him for a while. The problem was that when he tried to furnish the future room, to give it texture, to give it the quality of a place that was inhabited rather than used, the details he reached for were details from the room above the bookshop. The quality of the morning light. The particular smell of the coffee. The sound of a voice speaking French with the deliberate care of someone who learned multiple languages and thinks about construction. He put his coffee down. He thought, "This is useful information and you should do something with it." He thought, "What you should do with it is nothing. The same nothing you have been doing." He thought, "Yes." He thought, "She would tell me I'm being a coward." He got up and went to reorganize Margit's cellar, which needed it, and which was something he could do correctly and completely and which would not cause any problems. He had been down there for 40 minutes, working with the methodical satisfaction of a man who has decided to be useful, when he heard Margit on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway, looked at the cellar, which was now organized with the kind of precision that was going to make it slightly difficult to find anything if you didn't know the system, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You're nesting." Alexander did not look up from the crate he was moving. "I'm being useful." "Yes," Margit said, in the tone of someone who has said the more interesting thing already and is waiting to see if you notice. He looked up. She had her arms crossed and the expression she used when she was not asking a question she already knew the answer to. He held her gaze for a moment. He looked back at the crate. "The bottles from Burgundy are better stored on their sides," he said. "I know how to store wine," she said. "I have been storing wine since before you were born." A pause. "Did you eat this morning?" "Yes." "Did Émile eat?" Alexander thought about this. He had made coffee. He had not noticed whether Émile had taken bread from the kitchen before he left for his morning errand. "I don't know," he said. Margit said, which was a different sound than her usual economy. It was the sound of someone who had just received confirmation of something. She went back upstairs. Alexander looked at the Burgundy bottles. He thought, "I do not keep track of whether Émile eats breakfast. That is not a thing I have started doing." He thought about whether it was a thing he had started doing. He thought, "This conversation is over." He finished the cellar. The laugh happened 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, when they had been at the table for 2 hours over maps and schedules and the careful geometry of the remaining drops, and Alexander had been running the timing on the third route in his head and cross-checking it against the patrol schedule and had said, almost to himself, because it was the kind of thing he said aloud sometimes as a grounding mechanism, the inventory of facts as a way of keeping the mind from going somewhere it shouldn't. Tuesdays the secondary patrol takes the Rue Sala, which puts them at the corner of the Rue de Brest at approximately 9:40, which is 7 minutes after our window closes. Émile looked up from the map. He said, "The Rue de Brest." His voice was entirely neutral. His face was entirely neutral. And then something crossed it, not quite an expression, more like the ghost of one, the shadow of a thought that had arrived and been immediately categorized as something he was not going to say, and he looked back at the map. Alexander said, "What?" Émile said, still looking at the map, "Oberleutnant Weiss visits an apartment on the Rue de Brest on Tuesday evenings." A pause. Alexander said, "That's tactically relevant." Émile said, very carefully, still looking at the map, "It is." Another pause. Alexander said, "What floor?" And Émile, who had been performing evenness for 14 days with the precision of a man who has spent his entire adult life learning to perform evenness, looked up, and there was a fraction of a second, less than a second, where the evenness stopped completely, and said, in the voice of a man who has been trying not to laugh and has lost the argument, "Third." Alexander did not plan to laugh. The laugh arrived before he had decided anything about it, flat, very dry, genuine in the way that the real laugh was always distinguishable from the polite one, which he had been told and did not disbelieve. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it was gone. He was aware, after, that his face had done something he could not fully account for, and that Émile was looking at him with an expression that was not performing anything. Just looking. As though he had been handed something unexpected and was deciding whether to hold on to it. Alexander looked back at the map. He said, after a moment, "We'll need to adjust the approach for the third drop." Émile said, "Yes." His voice was back to even. But there was something in the even that had not been there before, a quality, very slight, like a room after a window has been opened and closed, the air inside a fraction different. Not performing the even. Simply being in it. They adjusted the approach for the third drop. They worked for another hour. The lamp burned low and the streets outside settled into their particular quiet, and neither of them mentioned the laugh and neither of them needed to, because some things, once they have happened, do not require mention. They exist in the room from then on, take up their small amount of space, require nothing from either person but the implicit acknowledgement that they are there. Alexander walked back to the bookshop that evening. They had gone out separately, as usual, for the last stage of the route, and he thought about Sophie. He did this deliberately, as the corrective, the application of evidence to pattern. He thought about Sophie and he also thought about the laugh, and the two thoughts were still not separating the way they should have been. He thought, she would tell me I'm being a coward. He thought, she would be right. He thought, I know how this ends. He thought about this for most of the walk back and arrived at the bookshop and went upstairs, and Émile was already there with a book and a candle, and the room had the inhabited quality it always had now. And Alexander sat down on the cot on the side away from the wall and did not do anything different from what he had been doing and did not say anything he had not been saying, and the evening was ordinary and he stayed exactly where he was. He had been here before. He knew how it ended. He stayed. Later, after Alexander was asleep, after the city had settled into its late-night quiet, Émile sat at the table with the candle and a sheet of paper, and the fourth letter wrote itself in approximately the time it took to stop pretending he wasn't going to write it. He folded it when it was done. He took L'étranger off the shelf and tucked it in the spine with the others. He put the book back between the Gide and the Flaubert. He blew out the candle. He thought about the laugh, the real one, 2 seconds, gone before he could account for it, and thought, I have been thinking about it for 6 hours. He went to bed. Chapter 7, What Warmth Requires. The cold arrived properly on the 19th of December. Not the cold they had been managing, the habitual Lyon December cold that required a coat and consciousness and not much else. This was the other kind, the kind that arrived with intent, that found the gaps in the window frame and the thinness of the blanket and the particular inadequacy of a stove that had been designed for a room used occasionally rather than lived in continuously. By the third day of it, the room above the bookshop was cold in a way that could not be resolved by adding a layer or moving closer to the stove. The cot became a different negotiation. They did not discuss this. The cot had always been a negotiation of a kind, 2 people sharing a sleeping space and both being reasonable about it, which in practice meant maintaining a distance that was, given the dimensions of the cot, a matter of deliberate choice on both sides. They had been maintaining this distance for 18 days. It had required, at the start, some effort. By the second week it had become habit. By the third week, habit had become something else, a kind of negative space, a shape defined by what was not there, which both of them were aware of in the specific way that you were aware of something you had agreed not to look at directly. The cold made the distance expensive. Neither of them acknowledged this. They acknowledged it instead in the way that men like them acknowledged things, by adjusting without discussion. The distance did not close, exactly. It became less deliberate. There was a difference between choosing the distance and simply being aware that you were not choosing it at every moment, and somewhere in the third week of December that distinction had shifted in a way that neither of them had made a decision about. On the night of the 19th, the stove went out at 3 in the morning. Émile woke to cold and the specific quality of silence that meant the temperature had dropped further while he slept. He lay still for a moment, taking stock in the way he woke, cataloguing before opening his eyes, letting the information assemble. Cold. The stove. Alexander's breathing beside him, slow and even and asleep, which meant the cold had not woken him yet. He should get up and relight the stove. He did not get up and relight the stove. He lay in the dark and thought about getting up and relighting the stove and did not do it, which was not like him. He was, in most things, the person who got up and did the necessary thing without deliberating. The deliberation was telling him something. He chose not to decode the message. Beside him, Alexander was very still. The stillness, Émile had learned, did not reliably indicate sleep. Alexander's sleeping stillness and his awake stillness were different, a matter of breathing, of the particular quality of attention in a room with someone who was conscious versus someone who wasn't, something he could not have described precisely but had mapped over 18 nights. He was not sure, now, which it was. He was not sure this was a question he could ask without it becoming a different kind of question. He looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was dark and cold and offered nothing. Outside, a wind he had not heard earlier was moving through the street, not violent but sustained, the kind of wind that found the gaps. He thought, in French, I should relight the stove. He thought, in German, which he used when he wanted to be honest with himself because it was the language he used operationally and honesty was an operational quality, I am not going to relight the stove. He thought, in Arabic, which was the language of something smaller and more private, I have been lying awake like this for 18 nights and I am very tired of it. He was aware, in the precise way he was aware of most things he was trying not to be aware of the warmth that was available approximately 8 inches to his left. Then, to the ceiling, in a voice that was quiet enough to be absorbed if the man beside him were asleep, in Hamburg, before the war, I had an apartment with a heating problem in February. A pause, in which the wind moved through the street and the cold held. I used to sleep in my coat. Émile went very still. Then Alexander said, without inflection, without performance, in the same quiet voice he used for things that were true, "This is better than that." The silence after this was not the silence of a thing not discussed. It was the silence of a thing that had just been placed on the table between them, gently, without fanfare, and was waiting to be seen. Émile thought about 6 languages. He found, in none of them, the precise word for what was being offered, not the words of the sentence, which were simple, but the grammar beneath them, the structure of a man who did not say personal things choosing to say one. A small thing about Hamburg. About a coat. About before the war, when there had been an apartment and a heating problem and a person who had lived inside an ordinary life. He said, after a moment that was somewhat longer than it should have been, "I grew up in Marseille." He paused. My mother put extra blankets on the floor and told me the cold was good for character. Another pause, in which the sentence sat between them and he decided whether to finish it. I don't think she was right. The silence that followed was different from every other silence in 18 nights. Not the silence of 2 men being careful. Not the silence of 2 men being professional. Not the silence that was the shape of what they were not saying. It was, Émile thought, and he catalogued this with the same precision he brought to everything else, because it seemed important to catalogue it correctly, the silence after 2 people have said something true and the truth is sitting in the room and nobody is doing anything about it. They lay in the dark. The wind moved in the street. The cold was not resolving, but it was, in some way that had nothing to do with the temperature, slightly less than it had been. They were not touching. The distance between them was still a choice, still present. But the deliberateness of it had changed. It was no longer a wall, exactly. More like a threshold. Something you could see across. He looked at the ceiling. Alexander said, very quietly, not to the room but to the ceiling, to the dark, to the wind, "What was her name?" "Your mother." The question arrived like something thrown carefully, underhand, with no speed behind it. Émile said, "Farida." The name felt strange in his mouth, said aloud in this room, which was not strange. He had said her name thousands of times, but strange in the specific way of a thing said to someone you have not told things to, for the first time. She was from Oran. She came to Marseille at 20 and never fully accepted that it was colder than where she grew up. A pause. She made very good coffee. She said it was the only reasonable response to the French winter. He was quite sure he heard, a sound from Alexander that was almost, not quite, the beginning of a smile. Not the laugh. Something quieter. He thought, I am going to remember that sound. He thought, I should stop cataloguing things I am going to remember. They lay in the dark for a while longer. Neither of them said anything else. Neither of them relight the stove. The cold remained but had become, in the manner of the room's specific gravity, something that was theirs to manage jointly rather than separately, which was a different thing from the same temperature. Émile fell asleep with this thought still in him, half-formed, and did not notice when he fell asleep, which was unusual. He was generally aware of the transition. In the morning, neither of them discussed it. Nothing needed to be discussed. They had arrived somewhere in the night, the 2 of them, by saying small and true things to a ceiling in the dark, and the somewhere they had arrived at did not require naming to be real. They both knew what the pretense had been. They both knew it was over. The knowing sat in the room the same way the morning light sat in the room, ordinary, available, not requiring anything of them. Alexander made coffee. He made it the way Émile took it, slightly stronger than his own preference, a detail he had calibrated without announcing he had calibrated it. He set it on the table and did not look particularly at Émile and was not performing the not looking. Émile took the coffee. He drank it. The stove went out, he said. I know. I should have relighted it. Alexander said nothing for a moment. Then, in the flat, dry way he occasionally said things that were funnier than they appeared, yes. Émile looked at him. Alexander was looking at the window, at the cold gray Lyon morning, with the expression he sometimes wore when something had been decided and he was sitting with the decision. Not unhappy about it. Just sitting with it. Émile looked at the window too. Outside, the 19th of December was doing what it did, the patrol, the baker's boy on his bicycle, the ordinary machinery of an occupied city managing its morning. The cold had not relented. But upstairs, above the bookshop, in the room that smelled of old paper and turpentine, there was coffee and there was the quality of a shared silence that had changed, quietly and irrevocably, sometime in the night. Émile sat down at the table. He thought, the 5th letter. He wrote it that evening, after supper, after Alexander had gone to wash up, sitting at the table with the candle and the map of the remaining drops and the cup of cold coffee he kept forgetting to drink. He wrote more than he had written in the previous 3 combined. The handwriting was less precise from the 2nd paragraph onward and became, near the end, approximately the handwriting of a man who has stopped performing and has no resources left to start again. He put it with the others inside the spine of L'Étranger. He held the book for a moment after, the way you hold something that has become heavy not because of what it is but because of what it contains. He put it back on the shelf. Orange spine between the Gide and the Flaubert. He went to bed. In the dark, the distance was still a choice. It was still present. But it was not, any longer, the thing it had been a week ago. It was the thing that comes after 2 people have said true things to a ceiling in the night and the ceiling has kept them. He lay still. Alexander was already asleep, the real sleep, the settled kind. His breathing was even. Émile listened to it for a while and did not construct sentences in any language and fell asleep more quickly than he had in 18 nights. Chapter 8, The Specific Weight of Here. He noticed the coffee first. Not on the day he started making it the way Émile took it, he had not noticed on that day, having made the adjustment without marking it as an adjustment. He noticed 11 days later, when Margit came upstairs for something she had left on the shelf and watched him measure the grounds and said nothing, and he realized, from the specific quality of her not saying anything, that she had been watching him do this for some time and had been equally quiet about it for some time, and that the watching and the quiet were a form of opinion. He had been making Émile's coffee the way Émile took it since the morning after the stove went out. He had not decided to do this. It was simply what he had started doing, the way you started doing things once you had allowed a fact, the fact of a person's preference, the fact of their particular need for a thing slightly stronger, to become real to you. Once a fact was real to you, the doing followed without requiring a decision. This was, Alexander understood, how things became habits. He understood it as a structural observation rather than a personal one and spent approximately no time considering the difference. He noticed the exits the same week. Or rather, he noticed their absence. He had stopped cataloging them on arrival at the 8th day. He had noted the stopping, filed it as a variable to monitor, and not monitored it. Now, 3 weeks into the 6-week stay, he conducted a deliberate inventory and found that he could no longer say with confidence which side of the window latch engaged first, or whether the second stair from the top squeaked or the third. He knew the information was there, filed, accessible, but it had migrated from the foreground, where he kept things he was managing, to the background, where he kept things that had been resolved. He considered this. He did not like it, in the abstract. He understood why it had happened, which was that the room above the bookshop had stopped reading as temporary. He sat with this for a while. The room above the bookshop was temporary. This was a fact that was not going to be revised by the room ceasing to read as such. His body's reclassification of it was a failure of the system, a kind of optimism he could not afford. He should correct it. He spent the morning correcting it. He rememorized the window latch. He counted the stairs. He reminded himself, specifically and at some length, of the operational picture, the papers, the timeline, the Swiss border, the city on the other side of it where he would begin the project of becoming a person with a future. He built the future room again in his head and furnished it carefully, a table, a window, a city that was not this city, coffee that was his preference rather than calibrated to anyone else's. He built it and it held and it was credible and he was almost satisfied with it. Then Émile came upstairs from the bookshop with ink on 2 of his fingers and said, without looking up, Margit is asking whether you want soup at lunch or whether you've eaten, and Alexander thought, soup, and the future room lost a wall. He thought, this is a problem. He thought, yes. He said, soup. The thing that was happening was not something he had a clean word for, even in German, even in the language he used for honesty. It was something he had felt once before in a way that was comparable, which was the feeling of not being a person in transit through a space but a person who was in a space. The distinction sounded minor. It was not minor. Being in transit meant that the space was temporary by definition, that nothing you did in it was real accumulation, that the exits and the timing and the next operational step were the foreground and everything else was background. Being in a space meant the opposite. It meant the exits had migrated. It meant you knew how a person took their coffee. He had been, for 3 years, a person in transit. He was becoming, without having made a decision about it, a person who was in a space. The cellar reorganization was finished. He had, without planning to, begun reorganizing other things. The kitchen shelf, which had been organized by size in a way that bore no relationship to frequency of use. The maps on the table, which he had filed and cross-referenced with the operational schedule in a way that would make Émile's briefing preparation faster. He had found a crack in the staircase landing that was going to be a problem in wet weather and had told Margit, who had said, yes, it's been a problem for 6 years, in the tone of someone who did not need the problem solved, and Alexander had fixed it anyway with material from the cellar, because it was fixable and the alternative was to know about an unfixed thing. Margit had looked at the repair, looked at him, and said, you remind me of someone. He had asked who. She had said, my husband. He died in the last war. He fixed everything he could find a way to fix. A pause. He couldn't fix the war. It bothered him considerably. She had gone back to the shop. He had stood on the landing and thought about this for a while. He was thinking about it still, in the quiet moments between operational tasks, in the early mornings before Émile was awake, in the long evenings after the lamps went low, because it seemed to him to be a kind of data he should examine rather than file. A man who fixed what he could fix because the alternative was to live with a known problem. A man for whom the fixing was not entirely about the thing being fixed. He thought, I know why I fix things. He thought, yes, but knowing why does not mean you have understood the shape of it. On Christmas Eve, Alexander woke at 6 and made coffee and went to the window and watched the street for a long time. Lyon observed Christmas as it observed most things under the occupation, quietly, with the specific restraint of a city that had learned to keep its celebrations internal. There were no decorations in the street. There was no particular quality to the morning that distinguished it from the morning before. But there was the fact of it, the 24th of December, which he had spent in 9 different places over the course of his life, none of them the same, most of them far from where he had been born, and none of them like this. Margit came upstairs in the evening with a bottle. She set it on the table without explanation. It was a Burgundy from a year he didn't recognize, the label slightly faded, the kind of bottle that had been kept for a reason and was now being opened for a reason, neither of which she specified. She poured 3 glasses and set 2 of them on the table and took the third to her chair by the stove and sat down. They were quiet for a while in the way that people were quiet when the quiet was a thing they were sharing rather than a gap they were managing. Alexander looked at his glass. He thought about Christmas in Hamburg, his mother's good plates, the smell of something warm in the oven, Lena at 14 with her hair in a braid, complaining about the carol they had been made to sing at school. He thought about Lena's voice at 14. He thought about her voice in the last letter, which was older than that, impatient and fond and exasperated in the particular way she was always exasperated with him. He thought, she would have liked this wine. He thought, I do not know where she is tonight. He set this thought down, carefully, the way you set something fragile down when there is no good place to put it. He said, more to himself than to either of them, very quietly, Frau Weihnachten. The words sat in the room. German, in a room above a bookshop in an occupied French city, in December 1943. He had not said the word aloud in 3 years. It had come out before he'd decided. He waited for the room to do something with it. Émile looked up from the map he had not really been reading. He said, Frau Weihnachten. In German. Without looking up again. Quietly, as though he were saying it to the map, or to the room, or to the general fact of the evening, rather than to anyone in particular. His German was very good. Of course it was. He had 6 languages and German was one of them, and this was not, Alexander understood, a thing he had done without knowing what he was doing. He had said the words in Alexander's language, in the language of the country Alexander had left, because he had understood that they were not said to the room but to a person who was a long way from where those words had first meant something. Alexander looked at the wine in his glass. Margit said nothing. She had the expression of someone who has witnessed a private thing and is doing the courtesy of not witnessing it. They drank the wine. Later, after Margit had gone downstairs and the lamp had burned low and the evening was quiet around them, Alexander lay on the cot and thought about the day after Lyon. He allowed himself this, which he had done once before, in the 8th week, and filed as a variable to monitor. He allowed himself a full day this time, the morning, the coffee, the window looking out onto a city that was not this city but that had light in it and time in it and no operational requirement for a certain kind of stillness. He allowed himself, and this was the part he had been refusing, the part he had been folding up and putting away since the cooking dinner, since the candles, since the morning after the stove, to put a person in the room. Not a specific presence. Not a form or a face or the sound of a voice. Just, the quality of the room when it was not empty. The particular inhabited weight of a space that had 2 people in it who had stopped being careful about being 2 people. He allowed himself exactly this much. He folded it, as he had folded it before. But he did not put it in the part of himself where he kept things he had decided not to examine. He kept it somewhere else. Somewhere slightly nearer. A place without a name. Outside, Lyon was quiet in the way it was quiet on the nights that deserved to be something else. Beside him, Émile was reading, or lying still with the book open, which was what he did when he was not reading but wanted to be left to not read. The lamp threw its shadow on the east wall. The shadow was still. The burgundy had been good. The room had the specific weight of a place where 2 people had stopped being in transit, quietly and without announcement, and were simply here. Alexander closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he did not imagine the morning in terms of what came next. He imagined it in terms of what was. Beside him, after a while, he heard the sound he had heard before, the small particular sound of a drawer and then a pen. He lay still and did not open his eyes. The sound of the pen was quiet and continued for some time and then stopped, and there was the sound of paper being folded, very small, and then the lamp went out. He thought, operational notes. He thought this and did not pursue it and did not believe it and let the thought go and fell asleep with the smell of the burgundy still faint in the room and the specific weight of the 24th of December settled around them like something that had decided to stay. Chapter 9, The Papers Have Arrived. Parancel came on a Monday. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, French-Swiss in the way of someone who had been on both sides of a border long enough to belong entirely to neither, with a priest's collar and a practical man's eyes and the manner of someone who had decided that God was best served through the efficient movement of paperwork. He had been processing exit documents through the network for 2 years. He did not ask questions about the people the documents were for. He did not remember faces. He considered both of these policies a form of ethics rather than convenience, and Émile respected him for the precision of this. He arrived at the back entrance of the bookshop at 9 in the morning, as arranged. Margit brought him upstairs. Émile was already at the table. Alexander was not in the room. He had gone out early, a contingency walk, the kind he took every few days, mapping the current state of the streets with the methodical patience of someone who updated his operational picture the way other people updated their accounts. He would be back within the hour. This was known. Parancel sat down, took a folder from inside his coat, and set it on the table. "The papers are ready," he said. "The route is confirmed. The departure window opens January 7th and closes January 9th. After the 9th, the border contact rotates and we lose the corridor for 3 weeks minimum." Émile looked at the folder. He did not pick it up immediately. "The crossing," he said. "Clean. The contact is reliable. There have been 3 successful crossings on this route in the last month. Ansel paused, which for him was the equivalent of a longer man's emphatic gesture. He should leave no later than January 9th. Preferably the 7th or 8th. I understand. The documents are in his operational name. The Voss papers won't travel. The new name is Moreau. French, from Lyon, which is plausible given the accent. He said this without irony, which was the most appropriate way to say it. He'll need to memorize the biographical details before the crossing. He'll manage. Ansel looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of a man who has processed enough people through enough safe houses to have a finely calibrated sense of when a response means the thing it says and when it means something else. He said nothing further about it. They confirmed the dead drop timing for the document transfer. They confirmed the contingency if the first window was missed. They confirmed the contact on the Swiss side and the address in Geneva where Alexander would check in on arrival. Ansel stood, took the folder. He would leave the document separately, through the drop, to minimize the risk of a single point of seizure, and adjusted his collar. He said, "He's been careful, your courier. No footprint in the city that I can find." "He's good at that," Émile said. "Good." Ansel picked up his hat. "So are you. It's been clean work." He said this the way he said compliments, as data, without warmth, which was the only form of compliment that Émile had ever found credible. "Good morning, Renard." He left. Émile sat at the table. He sat at the table for 40 minutes. He was aware of the time passing in a way that was not usually his relationship with time. Usually time was a resource to manage, to allocate, to account for. Now it was simply moving, and he was watching it move, and he was not doing the thing he would have done in any previous version of this situation, which was to begin immediately with the next operational task. Margit came in at some point. She looked at him. She put a cup of tea on the table in front of him and said nothing and went back out, which was her version of sitting with someone. He looked at the tea. He thought, January 7th. That was 11 days. 11 days was an operational fact. It was also a number, and the number had a quality that the previous weeks had not had, an end point, visible now, with a specific date on it. The papers were ready. The route was clean. The window was 11 days. He had known this was coming. The knowledge had been there since the first conversation with Ansel, since the timeline he had given Alexander on the first night, 4 to 6 weeks. He had known the shape of it. He had simply not known the date. The date made it different. He thought about Alexander learning the new name. Moreau, French, from Lyon. He thought about the biographical details Ansel had mentioned, the dates, the family history, the particular texture of an invented life that had to feel real enough to hold under questioning. He thought about Alexander memorizing this with the same even competence he brought to everything, the same methodical patience he brought to the route maps and the patrol schedules and the exits of every room he entered. He thought about Alexander on January 9th, or the 8th, or the 7th, in the gray coat, with the new papers, at a train station. He thought, I should get up. He got up. He walked to the shelf. He touched the spine of L'Étranger, not taking it down, and then took his hand away. He went to the window and looked at the street for a while, and the street offered nothing. When Alexander came back an hour later, Émile was at the table with the operational map and a pen and the professional expression that meant he had arranged himself into the frame before the door opened. Alexander looked at him the way he sometimes looked at him, with the fraction of a second's pause before the read, the microscopic delay of a man who was checking something before proceeding. Then he sat down in the other chair and looked at the map. Ansel came, Émile said. A stillness. Not the operational kind. The other kind. The papers are ready, Émile said. The departure window is January 7th to 9th. Alexander looked at the map. He said, good. The word was even. It was the correct word. It was the word the operational situation called for, and it was the word that was said, and Émile watched it come out of him and thought, he has been doing this as long as I have. He knows all the same words. He knows what to do with them. They sat with the word for a moment. Then Alexander said, still looking at the map, January 9th. Not a question. Just the date, said aloud, in the flat voice of a man testing the weight of a fact by giving it sound. Émile said, that's the latest date. You could leave sooner. 7th or 8th would be cleaner. Alexander said nothing for a long time. Outside, Lyon was doing what it did in the late morning, the particular sounds of a city at work, the bicycle bell, the voice from the bakery, the distant mechanical sound of something administrative. The ordinary machinery of a Thursday. Then he said, the contingency route for the third drop, if there's weather that delays it, we'd need to reschedule. He looked at the map. It's the 12th of the original schedule. That's the third. Émile said, yes. Prudent to have it complete before I leave. Émile said, yes, again, and they both knew this was not only about the third drop, and neither of them said so, and the map was on the table between them and the date was in the room and neither of them moved. January 9th, Alexander said, again. If you need it. A pause. Then, I may need it. Émile looked at the table. He thought about the tea he had not drunk that Margit had brought him. He thought about 11 days with a date on them and what it meant to have a number with a date on it, to have the end of a thing visible and specific when previously it had been general, approaching but not here. That night, he wrote the 7th letter. He wrote it quickly, which was not how he usually wrote. He wrote it the way a person wrote when the time for drafting had passed and what came out was going to be what came out, unmanaged. The sentence that ended mid-clause, I think if you turned around, ended because he could not finish it without making a claim he did not know how to make, without saying a thing that would require knowing how it would be received, and he had spent 13 years learning that this was not a risk you took. He looked at the unfinished sentence for a while. He crossed nothing out. He left it as it was. He folded the letter and put it with the others. He took L'Étranger off the shelf and held it. The book was heavier than it should have been, which was not a physical fact but was, in some other sense that Émile did not have words for in any of his 6 languages, accurate. He put the book back. He sat at the table until the candle burned low. He thought about January 9th. He thought about the particular quality of the room, which had been accumulating for 26 days and which would, on the 9th, stop accumulating. He thought about what a room became when a person who had been in it was no longer in it. He had lived in a great many rooms. He knew what they became. He blew out the candle and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about nothing, very deliberately, for a long time. In the morning he would begin preparing the contingency route for the third drop. The third drop was on January 3rd. That was 6 days away. January 9th was 13. He counted the days with the particular precision of someone who knows the counting is a form of wishing and is doing it anyway. Chapter 10, Everything He Learned to Want. The operational case for his departure was complete by December 29th, which was 2 days after Ansel's visit and 11 days before the latest departure date. Alexander built it the same way he built everything, methodically, point by point, without sentimentality. He ran it in his head on the morning walk, on the contingency routes, in the early hours before the room was fully awake. He built it until it was airtight and then he checked the seams and found no gaps and built it once more from the beginning just to be certain. Point, Henri Lacoste was still gathering. He had not found anything specific, but gathering was how finding began, and each day Alexander remained in Lyon was another day in which the category, defector, German courier, underground asset, could acquire a face. The longer he stayed, the narrower the margin. Point, the route was clean now. 3 successful crossings in the previous month, per Ansel. Border contacts rotated. This corridor would close after January 9th and the next window was 3 weeks minimum, during which the operational risk would be higher, the network more exposed, and Alexander a liability to the safe house rather than an asset. Point, Émile's position. Alexander staying past the departure window, past the operational need, past the papers, past the point where staying served any function beyond the personal, was a risk to Émile specifically. To Margit. To the safe house that had been running cleanly for 2 years. His presence made them all less safe the longer it continued without justification, and past January 9th, there was no justification he could write in the operational column that would survive scrutiny. Point, the Swiss border was a beginning. The other side of it was a room, a city, a language being used for something other than survival. It was the thing he had been running toward for 3 years, even when the running had felt like running away, at some level below the operational, some level at which he had not yet allowed himself to be fully honest. He had been running toward a life. He was almost at it. He could stop. The case was airtight. He ran it again on December 29th. He ran it again on the 30th. He ran it again on the 31st, which was the last day of 1943, and he had been running it every morning for 4 days, and it remained airtight, and it had not, in 4 days, made him feel any better about the conclusion. This was information. He filed it with the coffee and the exits and the shadow on the east wall and the specific quality of Émile's voice saying Frohe Weihnachten in German to a room in an occupied French city, and he thought, the operational case is correct and the conclusion is correct, and you are going to leave, and it is going to cost you something you do not have a word for in any language. He thought, yes. He thought, she would tell me I'm being a coward. He thought, she would be right. He thought, knowing you're a coward does not change the thing you're afraid of. The dead drop on January 3rd went nearly wrong. It was a cold, clear morning, and the street near the Hotel Dieu had been quiet on the previous 2 reconnaissance walks, and there was no reason to expect the patrol. The patrol came anyway, a Gestapo unit, not the regular Wehrmacht, with the specific purposefulness of a unit that had somewhere particular to be, and took an unexpected route that put them on the relevant street 4 minutes early. Alexander saw them from the corner and turned without altering his pace and took the first available door, a greengrocer's, cold and dim, with the particular smell of root vegetables in winter, and a woman behind the counter who looked at him with the careful non-expression of someone who had learned to have no opinion about men in grey coats entering their shop quickly. He bought a turnip. He stood at the counter with his turnip and waited while the patrol passed the window, their boots audible on the cold stone outside, and the woman bagged the turnip with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood the situation and had no intention of commenting on it. Cold morning, she said. Very, he said. He waited in the doorway for another 30 minutes, until it was safe. He completed the drop from the secondary position, a revised route that added 8 minutes and required him to cross the river twice, which was not ideal but which worked. He was back at the bookshop by noon, cold through to the bones in the specific way that 30 minutes in a winter doorway produced, and Émile was at the window. He turned when Alexander came in. He did not say anything. He simply, for a fraction of a second, before the professional expression was back in place, looked at him with the raw, unguarded attention of someone who has been at a window for an hour and had not entirely believed the person they were waiting for was going to come through the door. Alexander said, "It's fine. I'm fine." Émile nodded. Then he went to the kitchen and made coffee and returned with 2 cups and put Alexander's coat near the stove to dry without being asked and without saying anything about it, and they sat at the table and the coffee was the right temperature and neither of them mentioned the window. This was the day Alexander understood that the operational case, while correct in every particular, was not the whole truth. He understood it the way you understood certain things, not in a moment of revelation but in the gradual accretion of evidence that had been there for a long time, waiting for the moment when you stopped being able to not see it. He had been making the case for his departure every morning for 4 days. He had been making a version of the case, in various forms, since the first week. He had been doing it because it was correct and because correctness was the thing he was able to hold on to when the other things, the specific things, the inhabited things, threatened to become primary. The case was, I leave because it is safer for them. He had believed this. He had believed it with the full weight of his experience and his evidence and the 3 years of running that had taught him, specifically and with data, what happened when you became particular to someone and they became particular to you. He still believed it. He also understood, sitting across the table from Émile with the coffee and the coat drying by the stove and the window behind them and the drop completed and the route adjusted and January 9th 6 days away, he understood that the belief was not entirely what he had told himself it was. He left because it was safer for them. This was true. He also left because leaving was the thing he knew how to do. He had been doing it for 3 years. He had made a practice of it, a discipline, a skill. He had made it into a form of care. I leave, therefore I do not endanger, and the making into care had been so thorough that he could no longer see where the care ended and the cowardice began. They had the same shape now. They were wearing each other's clothes. He thought about Lena. He thought, you always do this. He thought, yes. He thought, I know. He thought, I am doing it again, and knowing I am doing it is not the same as stopping. He thought about what stopping would look like. He held the thought for exactly as long as it took to recognize its shape, and then he put it away, because it was January 3rd and the drop was done and the departure was 6 days out, and the case was correct even if it was not entirely what he had told himself it was, and the case was what he had. That night Alexander lay awake on the cot and ran the operational case one more time, and Émile slept beside him with his hand open, palm up, not reaching for anything, just open, the way a person's hand went when they were deeply asleep and the body had let the managing go. Alexander looked at the open hand in the dark. He thought, I am going to leave. He thought, leaving is correct. He thought, it will cost me something I do not have a word for. He thought about Lena. He thought, she would say, stop deciding. She would say, you have decided enough. She would say, in the voice she used when she had run out of patience with him, which was the voice she used most, Alexander. Just stop. He thought, she would be right. He thought, I know. The open hand was very still in the dark. He did not take it. He lay still until the gray of the Lyon morning came through the gap in the curtain, and Émile stirred and the hand closed and the moment passed, as moments passed, with the quiet efficiency of things that will not be mentioned and will not be forgotten and will be carried for a very long time in the place without a name. Chapter 11, The Last Practical Thing. The light in the bookshop on January 6th was the particular light of a city that had been managing winter for too long, flat, pale, neither morning nor afternoon, the kind that made everything look like a copy of itself. Émile had been in the bookshop since 8. It was now nearly 10. He had organized the same shelf 3 times and had still not managed to account for a gap between the Pegui and the Mauriac that had no explanation. He was not thinking about the shelf. Margit had gone out. She had told him where and he had heard her and retained nothing, which was unusual for him. He retained most things. She had left him with the shop and a list of customers who had books on hold and the particular quality of her going, which was the quality of a woman who had decided that a certain kind of space was needed and was providing it without announcement. He heard the clock at the end of the street strike 10. January 8th. Tomorrow. The latest date was the 9th, which was the day after tomorrow. He had told Alexander the 7th or 8th would be cleaner, and Alexander had said nothing for a long time and then said that the contingency for the 3rd drop needed to be confirmed first, and the 3rd drop had been on the 3rd, and it was now the 6th, and the contingency had been confirmed on the 4th, and the 7th was tomorrow. He moved the Pegui one place to the left. The gap remained. He looked at it. He went to the back table. He sat down. He took a sheet of paper from the drawer, the cheap kind, the operational kind, the same kind he had used 10 times before. He held the pen. He thought about what had been accumulating since the first night, when he had lain awake in 6 languages and found them all insufficient. He thought about the candle detail, the tea unprompted, the 20 minutes without contingency planning, the stove going out and neither of them relighting it, the wine on Christmas Eve, the open hand in the dark. He thought about all the things that had happened in 6 weeks in a room above a bookshop and had not been named, because naming required a word and he did not have the word, because the word did not exist in any language he had studied or spoken or used to survive. He wrote, should have said. He stopped. He looked at the sentence. He thought about what came next. He thought about the ways it might be completed, the declarative, the conditional, the subjunctive, the form of speech that was a claim and the form that was an observation and the form that was neither and both and simply the truth said aloud for once without management. He thought about what it would mean to write it. He thought about what it would mean to leave it unwritten. He sat for a long time. He put the pen to the paper again and got as far as the first letter of the next word before he stopped. He crossed it out. Not the letter, he crossed out the word he had intended to write, and the word after it, and the line as he might have completed it, going back and forth with the pen until it was unreadable, until it was simply black, until whatever he had been about to say was gone. He dated it. January 6, 1944. He folded the paper. He took L'Étranger off the shelf. Not quickly, he had been not taking it down since the morning of December 27th, treating it with the specific carefulness you treated something when you knew you were going to have to do something with it eventually and were not ready yet. He held it in both hands and looked at it. The cover was worn at the upper right corner in a way it had not been worn when he'd first placed it on the shelf. He had done that. Handling it in the evenings, not opening it. The wear was an accumulation. He opened to the back page. He sat with the pen over the blank last page for a moment that was longer than moments were supposed to be. He wrote, in very small letters in the margin, as small as he could make them, the handwriting of a man who had been taught that he should take up less space and was trying, for once, to do the opposite in miniature. He wrote, "Tu n'es pas à savoir comment c'est finit. Tu n'es tu n'y pas partir." He read it back. He closed the book. He sat with it in his lap and looked at the gap in the shelf where it had been, and the Gide on one side and the Flaubert on the other, and the space between them that was exactly the size of a book that was no longer there. Then he put the 11th letter into the spine with the others. He thought, there are 10 letters in there now and they will not be read and this one will not be read and you will put the book back on the shelf and in 2 days Alexander will be in Switzerland with his new name and his clean route and this will be a room with a shelf and a gap in it and a book you did not send. He thought, yes. He thought, this is the correct thing. He thought about putting the book back on the shelf. He thought about this for a while. He did not put the book back on the shelf. He was not, afterward, able to fully account for what he did next. He had been in the bookshop alone for 2 hours and the thought had not occurred to him before this moment and it did not announce itself as a decision. It arrived the way certain things arrived, already happening, the mind catching up to the body's conclusion after the fact. He stood. He went through the bookshop and up the stairs to the room. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The room was empty. Alexander had gone out on a final reconnaissance walk, the last check of the route, the methodical patience of a man who did not leave things to chance when he had the opportunity not to. His coat was on the hook by the door. The gray coat that had been good quality once, worn now in the specific way of a garment that had been through more than it was designed for and had held anyway. Émile looked at the coat. He looked at the book in his hand. He crossed the room. He put the book in the left pocket of the coat. It fit exactly, which was not surprising. It was a small paperback, and coat pockets were designed for exactly this. The fit was precise and ordinary and had nothing remarkable about it. He stood there for a moment with his hand still near the pocket. Then he went back downstairs. He went back to the bookshop. He straightened the Pegui and the Mauriac. He found the explanation for the gap, a volume shelved spine inward by accident, invisible until he ran his finger along the row and felt it, and corrected it, and the shelf was complete again, and there was no gap, and the shelf had not needed him at all. He made himself a cup of coffee he did not drink. He was behind the counter with the inventory list when Alexander came back, an hour later, with the particular quality of someone who has done the last thing they needed to do and is now simply waiting for the doing to be over. He came through the bookshop door and nodded to Émile and went upstairs, and Émile heard the familiar sounds of the room above, the coat hook, the water at the basin, the sound of boots on the floor, and looked at the inventory list and thought about none of the things on it. He thought, tonight is the last night. He thought, we both know that. He thought, neither of us is going to say it. He thought, yes. Alexander knew before he put his hand in his coat pocket. Not about the book, he didn't know about the book until later. But he knew, from the quality of the day and the finalized route and the papers now in the inside pocket of the coat, the papers with the name Moreau on them and the biographical details he had been running like a clean memory since the 4th, that this was the last evening. The knowing had a specific weight. Not grief, exactly, he had learned to be imprecise about grief, had learned to call it other things when it arrived. But weight. A density in the ordinary things that came from understanding that they were, very shortly, going to stop being ordinary and become something else. Memory, perhaps. The past. He made coffee. He made it the way Émile took it. He had been doing this for 4 weeks without marking the occasions. He marked this one. He set the cup on the table. Émile came upstairs at 6 and they ate. Margit had left something in the kitchen, a quietly deliberate abundance, the kind of meal that said I am not going to name this occasion and I am going to feed you properly for it, and they ate by lamplight with the operational map still on the table, and the evening was ordinary in the specific way it was ordinary only because both of them were working at it. They did not discuss the departure. The departure was confirmed. It required no further discussion. They talked about other things. Small things. Émile said something about a customer who had come in asking for Stendhal and had accepted Balzac with the confusion of someone who had been sent for one thing and was not sure the substitution was equivalent. Alexander said, without looking up from his plate, "It isn't." Émile said, "No." A pause, and then something that was almost a smile, the kind that arrived without decision and was gone before it required acknowledgement. They were quiet after that for a long time, in the way they had been quiet all month, the quiet that was not absence but presence, that had its own texture, that neither of them had to manage. Margit came up at 9 with a small glass of something and said, "I'm going to bed early." She looked at both of them with the expression of someone who has said what they intended to say and has said it without words, and then she went back downstairs and they heard the sound of her door. The lamp burned low. At some point the maps were moved to the table's edge and the lamp was turned lower still, and the evening did not so much end as narrow, the space contracting to 2 people and the specific quality of the room and the night outside the window, which was cold and still and completely ordinary in the way that Lyon had learned to be ordinary even on nights that were not. Alexander did not plan what happened next. He did not decide on it in the way he decided on most things, the deliberate construction, the operational architecture. It arrived the same way it had been arriving for 6 weeks, in small accumulations, each one smaller than a decision, each one adding to the weight until the weight was simply what the room contained and neither of them was pretending otherwise. He reached across the narrow space between them and put his hand over Émile's, which was on the table, open. Émile went very still. The stillness was the other kind, the kind Alexander had learned to distinguish, the kind that was not performed. He did not look up immediately. He looked at the table, at the lamp's low light on the maps at the table's edge, at the particular shadow on the east wall that had been there every evening for 6 weeks. Then he turned his hand over. What followed was quiet in the way that the most important things were quiet, not hushed, not careful in the way of performance, but quiet in the way of 2 people who had been saying something to each other for 6 weeks in every available language except this one, and were finally, in the last available hours, saying it in the one that remained. It was slow. It was, in the precise sense that Alexander had spent 3 years pretending he did not need things needed. Not desperate, desperation was the wrong register entirely. It was the opposite of desperation. It was the movement of 2 people who had all the time they had, which was not much, and who were spending it with the particular care you spent the last of something irreplaceable. He learned the specific warmth of Émile's hands. He learned the way Émile went still when something mattered and then, past the stillness, the way he came undone, not dramatically, not with the performance he brought to everything else, but quietly, in pieces, each one given rather than lost. He learned what Émile sounded like when he was not managing anything. He learned the exact location, on the left side of Émile's jaw, of a small scar he had never been close enough to see before. He told none of this aloud. He kept it. Émile learned the shape of the scar along Alexander's jaw, from the border crossing he had never described. He learned what Alexander's face looked like when the operational stillness had gone entirely, not the absence of feeling but the presence of it, undisguised, given freely by a man who had been withholding it from everyone including himself for 3 years. He learned that Alexander's hands, which were precise and deliberate in all things, were precise and deliberate in this too, everything considered, nothing accidental, the whole of his attention given without reservation to exactly where it was. The lamp went out at some point, the oil running low and Émile not getting up to refill it, because the dark was not the problem and the light had not been what was keeping them here. They lay in the dark, afterward, with the specific weight of the last night arranged around them and neither of them naming it. The cot had never been adequate for 2 people being separate. It was adequate for 2 people being together. This was an empirical fact. They had been arriving at it for 6 weeks. Alexander thought about what he had put away in the part of himself without a name, the image of a room with a window and a person in it, the quality of an inhabited space, the specific texture of a morning that did not require moving on. He took the image out. He held it. He put it back. He put it somewhere nearer. Émile did not sleep. He lay still and let the hours pass and catalogued nothing and constructed no sentences and thought about the particular quality of being known, not performed at, not managed, not attending to, but known, and how it was, in the actual experience of it, entirely unlike the thing he had spent 13 years being afraid of. He thought, I should have said. He thought, I said it. He thought, yes. Outside, Lyon was quiet. The patrol went past at its appointed hour and the footsteps were uninterested and the street was ordinary and the lamp in the street made a pale square on the ceiling that moved as the clouds moved and then was still. Alexander lay awake beside him with one arm beneath his own head and his eyes on the ceiling and his breathing even, and did not say anything. Émile did not say anything either. Neither of them needed to. This was the only language, at this point, that was not performance, the silence they had been building for 6 weeks, the particular quiet of two people who have been known to each other and have let the knowing sit in the room without requiring it to be called something. They lay in the last night of it and held it, quietly, until the first gray of the Lyon morning came through the gap in the curtain. Chapter 12, Very good at leaving. He had done this many times. He knew the exact sequence. The papers first, checked, tucked into the inside pocket of the coat, the pocket with the good button. The bag, which was small and had been packed since the 4th, 3 changes of clothing, the documents, the compass that had no operational use anymore but that he carried anyway, as other men carried rosaries. The route memorized to the point of habit, a habit so deep it had moved below conscious recall and existed now as the body's knowledge, the way you knew the stairs of a house you had lived in. He rose at 4:30. Not because 4:30 was necessary, the first train south was at 6:15. And the station was 20 minutes on foot, and the dead time was operational caution, the buffer he always built against the unpredictable. He rose at 4:30 because he could not sleep and had not been able to sleep since the gray of the morning came through the curtain, and lying still in the dark was a different problem from the one he knew how to manage. He moved through the room with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned that sound was a resource to be managed. The floor, which had developed over 6 weeks into something he navigated without thought, the board that creaked near the window, the particular resistance of the stove grate in the cold. He dressed in the dark. He checked the inside pocket. He picked up the bag. He did not pick up the coat immediately. He stood for a moment in the middle of the room with his bag in his hand and looked at Émile, who was asleep on the far side of the cot, the side nearest the room, his side, the side he had occupied since the 2nd week when Alexander had moved to the wall and then, later, moved away from it. He was asleep in the specific way of someone who had finally, sometime in the last hour, gone under. His face in the dark it was his face. Without the performance. The full version of the thing that Alexander had been learning to read for 6 weeks, and had, in the last hours, read without any obstruction at all. He looked at him for a moment that he would not allow to be longer. He thought, this is the correct thing. He thought, I know that. He picked up the coat. He put it on in the dark without checking the pockets. He should have checked the pockets, this was standard practice, the first thing you did before any departure, the inventory of what you were carrying. He did not check them. He was already moving toward the door. He went downstairs. Margit was in the bookshop. It was 4:30 in the morning, and she was in the bookshop, behind the counter, with a lamp turned very low and her hands flat on the wood surface and the expression of someone who has not slept and has not been trying to. She was wearing her gray wool over her clothes, which she wore in the shop in the coldest part of winter. She was not reading. She was simply there. He stopped at the foot of the stairs. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached below the counter and produced a cloth-wrapped parcel, bread and something, by the shape and smell of it. She set it on the counter. For the train, she said. He came forward and took it. Thank you. She did not say you're welcome. She said, come back when this is over. He held the parcel. He thought about the appropriate answer. He had given this answer in various forms at various departures. I'll try, I'll do my best, I can't promise, all the honest variants that were not reassurance but were not lies either. He said, I will try. She said, that's not what I said. He looked at her. She had the expression she used when she had said the more interesting thing already and was waiting to see if you noticed. The same expression she had used in the cellar, the day she had said you're nesting and he had said I'm being useful and she had said yes in the tone that contained everything she was choosing not to say. He looked at her for a moment longer. He said, I know. She nodded, once, in the way of a woman who has made peace with the fact that she cannot make people do what they need to do, and who is going to watch them go anyway and be there when they decide to come back, because that was the particular form her stubbornness took. Good morning, Alexander, she said. It was the only time she had used his name. He said, good morning, Margit. He went out. The street was dark and cold and had no opinion about him. January in Lyon at 4:30 in the morning was simply itself, the specific great arc that preceded dawn, the air that carried the particular cold of the river, the cobblestones that were slightly damp with the low mist that moved through the city in the early hours. A cat watched him from a doorway and lost interest. The patrol would not come through the street until 6. He knew the patrol. He walked. He took the long route, not because it was safer, exactly. The city was quiet at this hour and the route to the station had 3 options and all 3 were clean, but because the long route went past certain streets and the time was available and he was, despite his operational discipline, doing something that had nothing to do with operational discipline, which was taking the route that went past the specific cafe where a man had performed charm at a German officer while he sat 3 tables away reading a newspaper, and past the corner where they had walked in silence after a 2-letter word, and past the narrow street near the Saône where he had stood in a doorway for 30 minutes in the rain waiting for a patrol to clear. He walked through the city that he had been mapping for 6 weeks, that he had been learning the texture of in the way you learned a place you were living rather than a place you were passing through, and he walked through it in the dark before dawn on the morning of his departure, and he thought, I am very good at leaving. He thought, I have been doing it for years. He thought, I have left Bonn and I have left Berlin and I have left the Wehrmacht and I have left the places I have been since, all the safe houses and transit routes and brief inhabitations, all the people who had been specific to him for a moment and then had stopped being specific because he had gone, or because they had gone, which in the case of Sophie amounted to the same loss. He thought, I have left all of those. He thought, I am not sure, this time, that I am going to be all right. He arrived at the Gare de Perrache at 5:45. The station was quiet at this hour, the particular quiet of a large space with very few people in it, a cleaner with a cart, 2 women who had the look of market traders, a German soldier at the end of the platform who was cold and bored and not looking at anything in particular. Alexander bought his ticket, Moreau, the name arrived easily, which was the point of learning it so thoroughly, and found his platform and stood in the cold and did not put his hands in his coat pockets. He did not put his hands in his coat pockets for the same reason that he had not checked them in the room, because he was operating on a principle that if he did not reach into them, whatever was or wasn't there remained, for the duration of the train journey at least, undetermined. This was not a principle he had ever applied before. He was applying it now. The train arrived. He boarded. He found a compartment, 2nd class, nearly empty, a woman with a child asleep against her shoulder, an older man with a briefcase who was already asleep himself. He sat by the window. He put his bag on the rack above. He looked at the platform. The platform was ordinary. The station clock read 6:12. In 3 minutes the train would leave. He put his hands in his coat pockets. His left hand found something small and soft. He took it out and looked at it. L'étranger. Camus. The edition with the orange spine that had lived on the second shelf of the bookcase along the east wall, between the Gide and the Flaubert. The spine worn at the top edge in the way of a book that had been taken down and put back many times. The cover soft with previous handling, the particular softness of a paperback that had been read more than once by more than one person. The train began to move. He turned the book over. Nothing on the back that shouldn't be there. He opened it. He looked at the first page, which was the first page of the text, which he had read in a different life and set aside because it was too familiar. Then the letters fell into his lap like a confession that had been waiting a long time to be made. He stared at them. There were 11 of them. Not sealed. Never addressed. Folded in the particular way of someone who folds things not to send them but to make them smaller, more containable, more like something that could be kept without being a burden. The paper was cheap, the operational kind, the same kind he had seen on Émile's table 20, 30, 40 times across 6 weeks. The handwriting on the visible fold of the outermost letter was small and precise and familiar in the specific way that a thing became familiar once you had been sleeping beside the person who made it for 6 weeks and had learned their handwriting the way you learned the sounds of a house. He looked at them for a long time. Outside, the outskirts of Lyon were moving past in the early morning, buildings giving way to the first suburban scatterings, rooftops, a factory chimney, the gray of the winter sky coming lighter over the hills to the east. A normal morning. The city disappearing at the pace a train made it disappear. He thought about Émile, asleep when he had left. He thought about the specific quality of Émile's sleeping face, without the performance, without the careful management, simply the face of a man who was 32 years old and had, in the last hours, given everything he had been withholding for 6 weeks freely and without condition. He thought about what it had cost him. He thought about what it cost a person who had spent 13 years deciding that want was a liability to stop deciding that, for one night, in the dark. He looked at the letters in his lap. He picked up the first one. The train carried him south. Chapter 13, 11 letters and a margin note. The first letter began, "I have been trying to write this since the second week. Each time I get as far as the salutation and then I fold the paper because I don't know what you are to me and I refuse to write Dear Alexander when dear doesn't begin to cover it and I don't know the word in any language that does." Alexander read it once. He read it again. He set it in his lap and looked at the window, where the outskirts of Lyon had given way fully to the countryside now, the bare winter fields, the occasional farmhouse, a frozen creek catching what light there was. The woman with the sleeping child had shifted in her seat. The older man with the briefcase was still asleep. Nobody was watching him. He picked up the second letter. "You laughed today at something I said in the market." Not a polite laugh. The real one. "I have been thinking about it for 6 hours. I think I am in some trouble." 3 lines. That was all. He read them 3 times and then held the letter carefully, the way you held something small that might tear. He thought, 6 hours. He thought about the evening of the laugh, the dry, flat thing that had arrived before he had decided anything about it, and the way Émile had looked at him afterward with an expression that was not performing anything. He had known, when it happened, that the laugh had been visible in a way he couldn't fully manage. He had not known, until now, that Émile had been cataloging it for 6 hours afterward. He thought, I was doing the same thing. He put the second letter with the first and picked up the third. The third letter was a full page, both sides, the handwriting getting less precise as it went, the way handwriting went when the person writing it had stopped performing and started meaning it. Alexander read the front. He turned it over and read the back. He read it again with his hand flat against the page as though the paper might be warm. It was, in some sense he could not have explained physically, warm. The third letter was about the night of the dinner. The inadequate dinner, the kitchen negotiation that had been wordless, the 20 minutes without contingency planning. Émile had written it the way he might have written a field report if field reports were about the specific quality of a room and the way a person moved through a kitchen and the particular sensation of warmth arriving where you had not been expecting it. He had written it carefully, precisely, in the handwriting that was precise until it wasn't, and then in the handwriting that was the other kind, the smaller, more crowded letters that appeared when the care gave out and what was underneath came through. "I know the shape of what this is," the third letter said, near the bottom of the back page where the handwriting had gone small and crowded. "I have known the shape of it since the first evening and have been telling myself something else. I am not sure I am very good at telling myself something else anymore." Alexander set the letter down. He looked out the window for a long time. The countryside was doing what it did in winter, the specific gray patience of it, the bare trees, the occasional light in the distance that was a village or a farm or someone else's life continuing at its usual pace while his had done the thing it had just done. He picked up the fourth letter. And the 5th. And the 6th. They were shorter, briefer accumulations, the tone shifting across the weeks. The 4th was about the patrol schedule and how he had been thinking about it less as an operational fact and more as a structuring principle of their days together, which he noted was a category error of significant concern. The 5th, the long one, the one from after the stove, had the quality of a letter written by a man who had stopped being careful about being a man who was careful. I said Marseille and my mother's name and it came out of me before I decided to let it, Émile had written, and what I have not said in 13 years, the thing I stopped saying when I was 19, is, and then nothing, just the blank space of a sentence that had been started and not finished, followed by a new paragraph about the quality of the morning light through the gap in the curtain and how he had started to recognize it without looking up. The 6th letter was 3 sentences. I have been thinking about your sister. I don't know her name. I have been thinking about her anyway, the way you talk about the people you don't talk about, by their exact absence. I think she was very important to you. I think she still is. I think you are carrying her the same way I am carrying this letter, because there is no adequate place to put it down. Alexander looked at the sentence for a long time. He looked at it until the countryside outside blurred at the edges and he understood that something was happening to his face that he could not stop. He was aware, at a slight remove, that the woman across the aisle had shifted in her seat and was now sitting with the careful non-watching of someone who had registered a private thing and was giving it the courtesy of not witnessing it directly. He did not care. He read the 6th letter again. He thought, she knew. He thought, she was 19. He thought, I was 26 and I had already decided that this was not worth the cost, the specific weight of particular attachment, the liability of wanting someone who was irreplaceable and then losing them. And she was 19 and she knew it and she said so anyway and I. He stopped that thought. He put the 6th letter with the others and picked up the 7th. I keep thinking about what you said, the 7th letter read, about running so long you forgot what you were running toward. I want to tell you something and I don't know how to say it without it sounding like a claim I have no right to make, so I'll say it here instead, in a letter you'll never read. I think you've been running in the wrong direction. I think if you turned around. The sentence ended there. He held the letter. He thought about the night Perrin's cell had come, and the way Émile had said January 9th with the evenness of a man who had practiced the evenness carefully. He thought about the 7th letter being written that night, after he was asleep, by the light of the low candle at the table. He thought about Émile sitting at the table with a sentence he could not finish. He thought, I think if you turned around. He thought, turned around toward what? He thought, he knew what he meant. He knew and he couldn't finish it because finishing it made it a claim he had no right to make, which was what you thought when you had decided that wanting someone was a liability you had already calculated and declined. He thought, I know that decision. I made the same one. He set the 7th letter down with the others. The 8th and 9th were quieter, the tone of someone who had passed through the crisis of the unsaid thing and arrived on the other side of it, in a place that was not resolution but something like acceptance. This is what it is. I have decided to remain inside it. I am not going to explain this to myself further. The 8th mentioned the cellar, which made him pause. I watched you fix Margit's staircase and I thought, he fixes what he can fix. And I thought about what it would mean to be a thing that was fixable. I am not sure I am. But I thought about it. The 9th had a quality of accumulated stillness that was very similar to the quality of Émile's face in the last hours of the previous night, without management, without performance, simply present. The 10th letter was the one he had not expected. There is a word in Arabic, my mother's language, the one she gave me in pieces because she was afraid I wouldn't need it long enough to use it. There is a word, wad, which means something like the feeling of being overcome by longing. Not sadness exactly. Not want exactly. The feeling of being occupied by an absence so particular it has taken up residence in you. I looked it up once to make sure I remembered it correctly. I had been living in it for, approximately, 4 weeks. I want you to know this in case you ever find a way to understand it. Alexander read it twice. He thought about a woman from Oran who had come to Marseille at 20 and never fully accepted that it was colder than where she grew up and who had given her son, in pieces, the language of something particular. He thought about the word. He thought, wad. He said it, very quietly, to the window. He picked up the 11th letter. It was the shortest. I should have said. And then the black of a pen gone back and forth over something until it was unreadable. And then the date, January 6, 1944. 3 days ago. Yesterday. This morning, not this morning, Émile had been in the bookshop. He had been in the bookshop while Alexander walked the contingency route one final time. Alexander had come back and Émile had been behind the counter with his operational expression in place, and they had spent the evening being careful and then, after midnight, had stopped being careful. 3 days ago he had sat at the back table of the bookshop and written I should have said and then crossed out whatever came next until it was gone. Alexander looked at the black line for a very long time. He thought, he said it. He thought, not with words, not the words he crossed out, not the sentence he could not finish in the 7th letter. He said it the only way he could say it, which was the only way that did not require him to hand it over and watch it land. He thought, I know what that is. He thought, I have been doing the same thing for 3 years. The same specific refusal to give the unsaid thing a form that could be refused. He thought, except that he gave it a form. 11 times. And then he put them in a book and put the book in my coat pocket, which is. He stopped. He looked at the letters in his lap. All 11 of them, accumulated over 6 weeks by a man who had spent 13 years deciding that want was a catastrophe. He thought about what it cost to write even the first one, the man who had stopped saying true things at 19 and had not said them since, who had learned to be fluent in 6 languages and silent in the 7th, sitting down with a piece of cheap paper and writing, I don't know what you are to me and I refuse to write Dear Alexander when dear doesn't begin to cover it. He thought about the train pulling out of Lyon at 6:15. He thought about Émile waking up to an empty cot. He thought about the specific quality of Émile's stillness, the way he went quiet when something mattered, the stillness that was not the performed kind, the stillness of a man deciding how much to give away and then, in the last weeks, giving it anyway. He thought, I have left everyone I have ever. He stopped that thought. He looked at the book still in his hand. He turned it over. He looked at the back cover, which was plain and worn. He opened it to the last page, the final page of the text, which was blank, which had always been blank, which was the kind of blankness that a book kept at the end of itself for reasons no one had ever fully explained. In the margin of the last page, in very small letters, in Émile's handwriting, the small, precise handwriting of a man who had learned to make himself take up less space, something had been written. Something that had not been there when the book lived on the second shelf between the Gide and the Flaubert. Something written recently. Perhaps the previous night. Perhaps that morning in the bookshop, before dawn, before Alexander woke. Tu n'es pas à savoir comment c'est finit. Tu n'es tu n'y pas partir. You don't have to know how it ends. You only have to not leave. Alexander read it. He read it again. He read it a third time with the book held in both hands, very carefully, the way you held something that might be the most important thing you had read in 4 years of reading, things that might keep you alive. He thought, he wrote this and then he put the book in my coat. He thought, he wrote you only have to not leave and then he put the book in the pocket of the coat of the man who was leaving. He thought, he did not ask me not to leave. He said, you don't have to know how it ends. He said, you only have to. He thought, this is not a letter. This is not something he wrote and put away. This is something he wrote to be found. He put it in my pocket knowing I would find it on the train. He put it there deliberately, in the dark of the morning, while I slept. He thought, he gave it a form. He looked out the window. The train had crossed into the hills. The light was different now, lower, colder, the winter's sun at its angle of maximum unhelpfulness, turning the hills into a palette of gray and brown and the occasional dull flash of a frost that hadn't melted yet. A station went past without stopping. Someone in the corridor laughed at something, and the sound was very far away. He thought, I am very good at leaving. He thought, I have been doing it for years. I have made a practice of it and a discipline, and then I made it into a form of care. I leave, therefore I protect. And the making into care was so thorough that I could not see where the care ended and the cowardice began, and they had the same shape, and they were wearing each other's clothes. He thought about Lena. He thought, "You always do this, Alexander. You make yourself very useful and then you make yourself very gone." He thought, "She was right." He thought, "I know she was right." He thought, "Knowing she was right has not, in 3 years of knowing, changed anything I have done." He sat for a very long time with the letters in his lap and the book in his hands and the French countryside moving past in the grey of winter, and something happened in his face that he could not stop and that he was not, for once, trying to stop, and the woman across the aisle continued to do the courtesy of not watching and the older man with the briefcase slept on, and the train went south. He sat very still. He thought, "Tu n'es chuani pas parter." He thought, what would it mean? He thought, not the operational case. Not the papers or the border contact or the 3-week window closing. The case was correct. He knew the case was correct. He had been making the case every morning for 2 weeks and it was airtight and it had not, in 2 weeks, made him feel anything other than the specific weight of a thing that was correct and also cost something he did not have a word for. He thought, what would it mean to turn around? He thought, it would mean going back to the station in Lyon. It would mean the new papers, the new name, the Swiss border, the Geneva address, all of it remaining, all of it waiting, the operational future intact. It would mean returning to a bookshop on a street in a city under occupation and walking through the door, which was the most dangerous thing he had done in 3 years of running, and also, he understood now, the only direction that was not away from something. He thought, Émile would tell me it isn't safe. He thought, Émile would tell me this and also not mean it. He thought, would tell him the operational case and he would say yes and understand all of it and still be there at the counter with his inventory list and his cold coffee and the specific quality of his attention when it was not being managed. He thought, would tell him. And he would already know and neither of us would need to say it. He sat very still. He let himself want something. Not the careful, limited version, the image he had been folding up and putting in the part of himself without a name since the cooking dinner, since the candles, since the morning after the stove. The real version. The version in which he turned around. He held it for exactly as long as it took to understand that it was not a thing he could put away again. He did not turn the train around. He could not turn the train around. The train was doing what trains did, carrying him south toward a border and a city and the life he had been running toward for 3 years, which was still a life he needed to reach. He understood the operational reality. He had never not understood it. But he took the book and he turned to the last page, and in the margin below Émile's small letters, in his own handwriting, which was clear and slightly angular, the handwriting of someone who learned German as a first language and carries its angles in every script, he wrote 4 words. He wrote them by the light of the winter morning through the train window, with the pen he carried in his inside pocket beside the papers with the name Moreau on them. He wrote them because he did not know, with the certainty he preferred to operate from, that everything that followed would go as intended. He had been doing this long enough to know that certainty was not a thing the work provided. He wrote them because the case was correct and the case was not the whole truth, and the part that was not the case needed to be said in some form that could be found, because Émile had shown him that this was how it was done. You said the thing you could not say aloud in a form that could be kept, and you trusted that it would reach the person it was for. He wrote 4 words. He wrote them in German, which was the language he used for honesty. Ich komme zurück. Wart. I'm coming back. Wait. He put the pen away. He put the book in his coat pocket, the left pocket, where it had been, where Émile had put it, and looked out the window at the French countryside going past in the grey of winter and thought about nothing for a long time, which was the first time in 4 years he had thought about nothing, and it had felt like something rather than the absence of something. The train crossed into the hills. The station at the border was a small one, the kind that existed to be a point of transition rather than a destination. The crossing was clean, the contact, the check, the particular quality of waiting in a small stone room while papers were examined by a man who did not remember faces and did not ask questions. The holding cell came later. Not a cell, exactly, a room in a village near the Swiss border, one of the network's transit points, a room with a lamp and a cot and a guard who was reliable in the way that certain people in this work were reliable because they had chosen it carefully and maintained the choice. He was held there one night while the next stage of the route was confirmed. It was the night of January 10th. He lay on the cot and thought about the letters. He thought about all 11 of them, read in sequence, accumulating across the hours of the train journey like water finding its level. He thought about the second letter, "You laughed today," the real one, "I have been thinking about it for 6 hours." He thought about the sixth, with its precise and unassuming description of him carrying Lena the way you carried an absence that had taken up residence. He thought about the 10th, with the Arabic word that meant being occupied by a longing so particular it had moved in. He thought, Wad. He thought, yes. He had one lamp. He had a pen. He had the book. He took the book out of his coat pocket. He opened it to the last page. He read the small letters in Émile's handwriting. He read the 4 words in his own handwriting below them. He thought, these things need to be found. He thought, he will look for them. He will open the book and look for them, eventually. When the war is over. When the occupation ends and a man who has been performing calm in 6 languages in Lyon can allow himself, finally, to look. He thought, I need to be alive for him to find them. He was alive in the morning. He crossed the border. He kept going. Chapter 14, The Book Belongs Here. The shop was on the Rue de Rivoli, narrow-fronted, with 2 steps down from the street and a door that needed lifting slightly to close properly, which Émile had been meaning to fix for 6 months and had not fixed because some things about a space became part of it over time in a way that made correcting them feel like a loss. He had been here 18 months. He had not planned to end up in Paris. He had planned, vaguely, to end up somewhere quiet, the coast, perhaps, somewhere with enough wind to make silence feel active rather than empty. But a friend had needed someone to manage the shop while he recovered from something he didn't want to talk about, and Émile had said yes in the way he said yes to most things, fluently, without revealing whether he wanted to. It turned out he was good at the shop. He was good at knowing what people wanted before they asked, something about the way they moved through the space, what they touched and what they didn't, the particular quality of uncertainty in a person who had come for a specific book and was now questioning whether they had the right title. He was good at being still enough that people forgot he was there, which meant they said things they might not have said to a bookseller who felt like an audience. He was good at remembering which customers needed a recommendation offered gently from the side and which needed to be left alone to discover things at their own pace, and which, the rare ones, needed to be handed the right book without preamble, because preamble was the thing standing between them and the bookseller's job was to step out of the way. He had, in short, found an occupation that required every social skill he had spent his adult life developing in the service of the resistance and deployed them instead in the service of reading, which was quieter and safer and produced no measurable intelligence of any kind. He had almost convinced himself this was sufficient. The war had ended in May. He had been in Lyon when it ended, still there, still above the bookshop, still working with the remnants of the network in the particular disorganized grace of people who had been doing something necessary and were now trying to understand what they were without the necessity. Margit had continued running the bookshop. She had told him, in November of 1945, that a friend in Paris needed someone to manage a shop. She had said this to the back of his head while he was reorganizing a shelf, and he had said yes without turning around, and she had said nothing further about it, which was her version of approval. He had been in Paris since May 1946. The war had been over for 2.5 years. He did not know where Aleksander was. He had not known since the morning of January 9, 1944, when he had woken to an empty cot and the ordinary gray of a Lyon morning and the knowledge, which had been coming for 13 days and still arrived as something he was not prepared for, that the room above the bookshop was now a room with a shelf and a gap in it where a particular book had been. He had looked for Aleksander through the network, after the war. The network had been good at certain kinds of information and less good at others. Aleksander Voss, German national, Wehrmacht deserter, underground courier, the records of his passage through occupied France were partial and carefully maintained in their partiality. He had crossed into Switzerland on January 10 or 11, 1944. After that, nothing the network had could tell him with certainty. A man going by the name Moreau had been processed through Geneva in mid-January. There were rumors of a courier operating in the Italian network through 1944 and into 1945. There were other names, other crossings, the particular deliberate invisibility of a man who was very good at not leaving a footprint. He had stopped looking in March of 1946. Not because he had decided to stop, he had not made a clean decision. It was more that each inquiry produced less than the previous one, and the accumulation of less than produced, eventually, a kind of silence that was not the silence of a thing ended but the silence of a thing waiting, and Émile had become, in the 18 months of the Paris shop, quite practiced at waiting. He was good at waiting in the specific way he was good at most things he found difficult. He performed it very well. He managed the shop. He made excellent coffee that he mentioned to no one. He knew the names of the regular customers and their preferences and the particular quality of each one's relationship to books, which was a more intimate form of knowledge than most people gave it credit for. He read in the evenings. He touched the spines of books when he was thinking, which was his habit and which he had not managed to change, and occasionally he took a specific book off a specific shelf, not L'Étranger, that shelf was empty now, and held it for a while without opening it and then put it back. He had almost convinced himself, which is not the same as being convinced. It was a Thursday in November, 1947. The light in Paris in November did what it did, the particular amber of late autumn, low and golden, the kind of light that made everything look like it was already being remembered. He had always found this light difficult, for reasons he had never fully examined. He was behind the counter with an inventory list and a cup of coffee going cold. He was thinking about the Kessel he had ordered 3 weeks ago and had not arrived, and about whether the Beauvoir was in the right section, and about a customer who had come in Tuesday and left without buying anything but who would be back. He was certain she would be back, because she had the look of someone standing outside a door she had not yet decided to open. The bell above the door rang. He did not look up immediately. He had learned, in 18 months of this shop, that looking up immediately gave people the impression they were expected, which sometimes made them nervous. He finished the line he was writing on the inventory list. "Bonjour," he said. "Bonjour," said a voice. He looked up. The man at the door was wearing a gray coat that had been good quality once. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 35, the kind of face that had been weathered into something that resisted easy reading, that carried the specific marks of years spent in conditions that were not gentle. He had the stillness of someone who had learned stillness not as a temperament but as a survival skill. His hair was longer than it had been. There was more gray in it than there had been. He was holding his hat in both hands. He was looking at Émile. Émile looked at him. Something happened in the shop that had nothing to do with the inventory list or the cold coffee or the amber light, though the amber light did not help. It was the kind of light that made it difficult to pretend you were not feeling exactly what you were feeling. Émile had always found this light difficult. He understood, now, why. He thought, "Wad." He thought, "Yes. I'm looking for a book," Aleksander said, in French that was excellent and very slightly German underneath, the French of someone who had been speaking it for years now and was still, in the exact register of certain vowels, audibly the person who had learned it from books before he learned it from people. "We have several," Émile said. His voice was even. He was very good at even. "A specific one." Aleksander moved into the shop. He moved slowly, the way he had always moved, not cautiously, not performing caution, but with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who had learned to announce his presence in advance so that people had time to decide about it. He stopped at the counter. He was very still. The good stillness, not the operational kind, not the practiced kind. The kind that came from having run a very long way and stopped and was now waiting to find out if the stopping had been right. He reached into the inside pocket of the gray coat. He placed something on the counter between them. A paperback. Orange spine. Worn at the upper right corner in the specific way of a book that had been taken down and put back many times. The cover soft with handling, the particular softness of a book that had been read more than once by more than one person, that had been carried in a coat pocket through a French winter and a Swiss crossing and whatever came after, that had been held in a train compartment by a man reading 11 letters in sequence while the French countryside moved past. L'Étranger. "I've had this for 4 years, Aleksander said. "I thought perhaps it belonged here." Émile looked at the book. He was aware of several things at once, the inventory list still in his hand, the coffee still going cold, the amber light doing the thing it was doing, and the fact that his heart was behaving in a way that he would have described, in any of 6 languages, as completely unreasonable and entirely accurate. He was aware that his hands were very still, which was his tell, and that Aleksander was watching him and would know what the stillness meant and was not pretending otherwise. He put the inventory list down. He looked at Aleksander. Aleksander looked back. He was not performing anything. He had the specific quality of someone who has made a decision and come a very long way on the strength of it and is now standing at the last point before the decision becomes a thing that either holds or doesn't, and is very still, and is waiting. Émile thought about 11 letters. He thought about a crossed-out line and a date in January 3 years and 10 months ago. He thought about the last morning above the bookshop, when he had woken to an empty cot and the specific quality of a room from which someone had been removed, and had lain still for a long time before getting up, and had gone downstairs to the bookshop and had sat at the back table for 40 minutes without moving, and had then gone to the shelf where L'Étranger had been and had stood there for a while with his hand in the empty space between the Gide and the Flaubert. He thought, tu n'es pas parter. He thought, he found it. He picked up the book. He held it. He looked at the cover, the worn corner, the softness of the spine that was the softness of years. He opened it to the last page. He found, in the margin, in very small letters, below his own small letters, in a different hand, in the clear and slightly angular script of someone who had learned German as a first language and carried its angles in everything he wrote, 4 words. Ich komme zurück. Wart. He read them. He read them again. He looked up at Aleksander, who was standing on the other side of the counter with his hat in his hands and his face completely open, doing none of the things either of them had spent years doing, no operational stillness, no careful distance, no performance of anything. Just standing there. Just present. Just returned. You wrote in my book, Émile said. Yes, said Aleksander. That's, Émile stopped. He was fluent in 6 languages. He stood behind the counter of a bookshop in Paris on a November afternoon with the amber light coming through the window and a man in a grey coat on the other side of the counter and a worn paperback in his hands, and he searched all 6 languages, and found in none of them the word he was looking for. Not the word for this specific feeling, the word he had been reaching for since the first evening in Lyon, when a man with grey eyes had looked at the room and said all right without performing anything, and the word had not been in French or German or English or Arabic or any of the others, and had not been there since. He found that this was fine. Some things did not require the word. Some things had been said in other ways, in letters, and in margins and in 4 years of keeping a promise, and the word was not the point. The word was never the point. He closed the book. He set it on the counter between them. There's coffee, he said. It's cold. I could make more. Aleksander looked at him. The long, careful look, not the operational assessment, not the practiced reading of exits and vulnerabilities. The look of a man who has been on the road for 4 years and has arrived somewhere and is deciding, for the first time in a long time, whether to believe in the arriving. Then, very quietly, he smiled. The real one. Not the polite version, not the dry-flat version that surfaced unexpectedly and disappeared before anyone could comment on it. The real one, which Émile had seen once, in a café near the Place Bellecour, and had been thinking about for 4 years. Yes, Aleksander said. All right. The same word. The very first word he had said in the room above the bookshop in Lyon on the first evening, looking at the cot, before any of this had started. Émile went to make the coffee. He did not mention that his hands were not entirely steady. He did not mention several other things. He made the coffee with the care he always brought to coffee, which was considerable, and he brought 2 cups to the counter and set one down in front of Aleksander and kept the other himself, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The amber light came through the window. The shop was quiet and narrow and smelled of old paper, which was the smell of books and the smell of the safe house and the smell of everything they had been accumulating since December of 1943 without a word for it. Aleksander picked up his coffee. He drank it. He said, "It's good." "Yes," said Émile. "I know." A pause. Then, in the flat dry way, you always know. Émile looked at him. Alexander looked back. Neither of them said anything else for a while. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. Coda, these things take the time they take. In the margin of the last page of L'Étranger, in a holding cell in a village near the Swiss border, by the light of a single lamp, on the night of January 10, 1944, Aleksander Voss wrote 4 words in German. He wrote them because he did not know if he would be alive in the morning. He was alive in the morning. The 4 words were: Ich komme zurück. Wart. I'm coming back. Wait. He kept his word. It took him 4 years. But then, Émile had waited 6 weeks to tell the truth, and Alexander had never once held that against him. These things take the time they take. Fin.